Imagine discovering an ancient civilization that completely transformed an entire region of Europe, yet most people have never heard their name. What if I told you that hidden beneath the modern cities of Croatia, Bosnia, Slovenia, and Albania lies evidence of one of history's most remarkable cultural transformations? Today we're diving deep into the incredible story of the Urian Monks, a mysterious Bronze Age people whose rise to power represents one of the most dramatic population shifts in European history. And trust me, their story will completely change how you think about ancient Europe. Picture this. Nearly 3,000 years ago, across the wild landscapes of southeastern Europe, something extraordinary was happening. A new culture was emerging, one that would dominate over 160,000 square kilometers of some of the most challenging and diverse terrain on the continent. We're talking about an area roughly the size of modern-day Florida, but instead of beaches and theme parks, imagine towering mountain peaks, dense forests, treacherous coastlines, and countless islands scattered across the Adriatic Sea. From the snow-capped peaks of the Julian Alps, where eagles soar above ancient glacial valleys, all the way down to the sun-baked shores of the Adriatic Sea with its crystal-clear waters and hidden coves. These people were building something unprecedented. Their territory stretched like a massive arc across southeastern Europe, encompassing what we now know as Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and parts of Albania. But here's the mind-blowing part. They didn't just survive in this incredibly challenging landscape, they absolutely thrived. Now here's what makes their story so fascinating and different from every other ancient civilization you've probably heard about. This wasn't a sudden conquest led by some legendary warrior king. There were no massive armies sweeping across the land, burning cities and enslaving populations. Instead, what archaeologists have painstakingly uncovered tells us about a gradual, almost organic transformation that unfolded over nearly 1,000 years. Think of it as one of history's most successful cultural makeovers. Except instead of changing fashion trends or music styles, entire ways of life were being completely reinvented. The first clues of their existence started appearing in the archaeological record around 2000 BC, and this timing is absolutely crucial. This was right when massive changes were sweeping across the entire Balkan Peninsula, as part of what scholars call the Indo-European expansion. It was like a domino effect of cultural change that was rippling across Europe, and the Urians were both part of this wave and something entirely unique. At archaeological sites like Gradina, nestled strategically along the banks of the Bosna River, and the fascinating layered ruins of Vucedol in eastern Croatia, researchers began noticing something completely different from what came before. The pottery styles were evolving in ways never seen in this region. The metalwork was becoming more sophisticated, incorporating techniques and designs that seemed to come from nowhere. Even the way people organized their settlements was undergoing a complete revolution. But here's where the story gets really interesting. And this is something that sets the Urians apart from most other ancient cultures. What's remarkable is how this transformation varied dramatically depending on where you lived. Communities along the rocky Adriatic coastline developed in completely different ways than those hidden away in remote mountain valleys, each group adapting to their unique environment in ways that would define their distinct cultural identity for centuries to come. Think about the incredible diversity of landscapes these people had to master. Along the coast, they were dealing with fierce Mediterranean storms, unpredictable seas, and the constant challenge of making a living from fishing and maritime trade. Meanwhile, their mountain-dwelling cousins were navigating treacherous alpine passes, surviving brutal winters, and figuring out how to build defensible settlements on rocky cliff faces that would make modern engineers scratch their heads in amazement. The transition from whatever came before to recognizably Urian culture wasn't uniform or predictable. It was messy, complex, and absolutely fascinating. Some regions showed dramatic changes almost overnight, while others experienced a slow, gradual evolution that took generations to complete. This tells us something profound about how cultures actually develop and spread. It's not like water flowing downhill, but more like a complex web of influences, adaptations, and innovations spreading at different rates through different communities. What makes the Urian emergence even more intriguing is that they managed to maintain cultural unity across this vast and geographically challenging territory, while simultaneously adapting to radically different environmental conditions. Imagine trying to maintain a shared identity when your neighbors on the coast are dealing with completely different challenges than your relatives living in isolated mountain fortresses, hundreds of kilometers away. The archaeological evidence reveals a people who were incredibly adaptable and innovative. They weren't just copying what worked elsewhere. The Arxes were actively experimenting, combining local traditions with new ideas, and creating something entirely original. This wasn't cultural replacement, it was cultural evolution in action, and the results were spectacular. As we dig deeper into their story, we'll discover how these remarkable people developed some of the most sophisticated Bronze Age settlements in Europe, created trade networks that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean, and built fortified cities that would make medieval castle builders envious. We'll explore their mysterious burial practices, their incredible metalworking skills, and the way they managed to thrive in one of Europe's most challenging environments. But most importantly, we'll uncover how their innovations and adaptations laid the groundwork for much of what would later become the classical civilizations of the Mediterranean world. The Aryan story isn't just about one ancient culture, it's about understanding how human societies adapt, evolve, and create lasting change that echoes through history. Now here's where the Aryan story gets absolutely fascinating. Because these weren't just survivors, they were innovators who completely revolutionized how people lived in some of Europe's most challenging environments. Let me show you exactly what I mean. Along the rugged coastlines, Aryan communities faced a problem that would stump most ancient civilizations. How do you grow enough food on steep, rocky hillsides that seem impossible to farm? Their solution was absolutely brilliant. They created intricate terrace farming systems that turned these challenging slopes into productive agricultural land. But here's the genius part. They didn't just solve the farming problem, they simultaneously prevented the devastating soil erosion that would have destroyed their communities within a few generations. Take the remarkable site of Pharos on the island of Vera, where archaeologists have uncovered something that will blow your mind. These ancient engineers carved sophisticated irrigation systems directly into solid bedrock. Picture this. They channeled seasonal rainfall into storage reservoirs, hewn from living stone, creating water management systems that some modern communities would envy. The level of community coordination required for these massive undertakings tells us something incredible about Aryan society. These people had developed organizational skills that rivaled much later civilizations. But wait, it gets even more impressive. Up in the mountains, where brutal winters and short growing seasons would challenge even modern farmers, the Aryans developed completely different survival strategies. High-altitude excavations have revealed specialized livestock enclosures built from carefully fitted stones, designed specifically for managing sheep and goats in harsh mountain conditions. The archaeological evidence shows they weren't just keeping animals, they had mastered sophisticated dairy processing techniques that were absolutely crucial for surviving those long, deadly winters. Here's something that shows just how adaptable these people were. Evidence points to seasonal migration patterns where entire communities would move their livestock between summer mountain pastures and winter valley shelters. This wasn't random wandering mind-eyes. This was a calculated generational knowledge system that maximized resources across different elevations and seasons. Think of it as ancient resource management that would make modern environmental scientists take notes. Now, what makes the Aryan story even more compelling is how they interacted with their neighbors, or bees, weren't isolated communities living in cultural bubbles. Along their northern territories, they encountered Celtic populations pushing south from Central Europe. Instead of being overwhelmed or simply copying everything the Celts did, the Aryans did something remarkable. They selectively adopted certain metalworking techniques and decorative styles while maintaining their own distinct cultural identity. This shows incredible cultural confidence and adaptability. The eastern frontiers present an even more fascinating picture. Here, Aryan communities came into contact with Thracian peoples, creating what archaeologists call a cultural frontier zone. Sites in the upper valleys of the Morava and Vardar rivers show this incredible mixing of influences, artifacts that blend Urian and Thracian characteristics, suggesting either mixed populations or incredibly intensive trade relationships. Yet, even in these boundary regions, distinctively Urian pottery traditions maintain their integrity, showing us just how strong their cultural identity was. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Urian civilization was their trade networks. Archaeological evidence reveals they were moving exotic materials across incredible distances and challenging terrain. We're talking about obsidian from Mediterranean volcanic islands, high-quality flint from distant sources, and decorative shells from warm southern waters, all found in remote mountain settlements that should have been completely isolated from such luxury goods. The linguistic evidence, though limited, supports everything the archaeology tells us. Place names preserved by later classical writers show consistent patterns that distinguish Urian language from neighboring Indo-European tongues. This linguistic unity across such vast and challenging territory reinforces the picture of a remarkably coherent culture. The religious practices reveal a spirituality deeply connected to the landscape itself. Hilltop sanctuaries, often positioned at the same elevated locations they chose for defensive settlements, contained votive offerings including miniature weapons, ceramic vessels, and bones from sacrificial rituals. This wasn't coincidental. Urian spirituality was fundamentally tied to territorial identity and community protection. As specialized craft production emerged, we see clear evidence of increasing social complexity. Dedicated workshop areas within settlements show spaces specifically designed for metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacturing. The standardization of artifacts across wide geographic areas suggests not just shared cultural practices, but sophisticated systems of craft specialization and inter-community exchange. By the dawn of the first millennium BC, all these Bronze Age foundations had evolved into something extraordinary, increasingly sophisticated political structures that would define Urian society for the next 5 centuries. The scattered settlements and emerging social hierarchies crystallized into distinct tribal confederations, each controlling substantial territories and developing unique governance systems perfectly adapted to their specific environments. The Dalmatei Confederation emerged as perhaps the most formidable of these political entities, controlling the mountainous interior regions that encompass the challenging terrain of the central Dinaric Alps. Their primary stronghold at Dominium featured sophisticated urban planning with multiple terrace levels carved into hillsides, the uppermost tier reserved for what appears to have been a governing council complex. Now let's dive into what might be the most fascinating aspect of Urian civilization: how these different confederations developed completely unique political systems that were perfectly adapted to their specific environments. What we're about to explore will show you just how sophisticated these ancient societies really were. The Liburnian society represents something absolutely revolutionary in ancient maritime organization. Instead of trying to control vast territories like land-based empires, they organized themselves around maritime clans, with each clan controlling specific islands or coastal segments like pieces of an intricate puzzle. But here's what makes this system so brilliant. Each clan maintained hereditary rights to particular fishing grounds and anchorages, creating a maritime property system that prevented conflicts while ensuring sustainable resource management. Picture this incredible scene. Every year, representatives from these scattered maritime clans would gather on the island of Apsatides, which we now know as Croak, for what might be history's most unique political assembly. This wasn't just some casual meeting, might I add. This was where they coordinated massive naval operations, resolved territorial disputes that could have led to devastating clan wars, and elected fleet commanders for major expeditions that would determine their survival and prosperity. What's absolutely mind-blowing about these assemblies is how they operated. Unlike most ancient governments that relied on simple majority rule or the whims of a single ruler, the Liburnians developed maritime law traditions that recognized the unique challenges of governing scattered island communities. Every major decision required consensus among clan leaders, not just a simple vote. This system sounds impossibly complex, but it worked for centuries because it had to account for the reality that if you made enemies of your neighbors in the middle of the Adriatic Sea, you could literally be cut off from the rest of civilization. But here's where the Liburnian story gets really interesting. The economic foundation of their entire confederation rested on their absolute mastery of what we might politely call Adriatic piracy. And when I say mastery, I mean these people conducted naval raids with such incredible skill and coordination that even Greek and Roman sources, neither their enemies, acknowledged their naval superiority in these waters. This wasn't just random coastal harassment like you might imagine from movie pirates. The Liburnians had developed sophisticated intelligence networks that tracked merchant shipping patterns and seasonal trade routes with the precision of a modern logistics company. They knew when certain types of cargo would be passing through specific channels. They understood weather patterns that would make ships vulnerable, and they had perfected the art of appearing seemingly out of nowhere to capture valuable prizes. The captured vessels and cargo weren't just divided up randomly among whoever participated in the raid. They had developed complex mathematical formulas that ensured equitable sharing among participating clans while providing substantial portions for communal fleet maintenance and expansion. This wasn't just about individual profit readiness. It was about maintaining the naval infrastructure that kept their entire confederation powerful and feared. Meanwhile, in the southeastern regions of Rherian territory, the RDA Confederation had developed something completely different. Controlling the incredibly fertile valleys and coastal plains around Lake Skadar and the mouths of major rivers including the Drin and Bojana, their political organization reflected the agricultural wealth of their territory rather than maritime power. Unlike their mountain-dwelling cousins who organized around warrior raids, the RDA developed governance structures that emphasized land management and agricultural coordination. Think about the incredible organizational skills required. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems that needed coordinated labor from multiple communities, fostering political institutions capable of managing complex hydraulic projects and seasonal agricultural cycles that involve thousands of people working in perfect synchronization. The RDA settlements featured architectural innovations that were both practical and politically significant. Their large communal granaries weren't just storage facilities. No, they were constructed with advanced ventilation systems to prevent spoilage during long storage periods, and control over these grain reserves translated directly into political influence during periods of scarcity. When you control the food supply in an agricultural society, you control everything. Their ruling council included representatives from major agricultural districts, each responsible for coordinating planting schedules, labor allocation, and surplus distribution within their territories. This required a level of bureaucratic sophistication that rivals modern agricultural departments. Even their warrior aristocracy differed dramatically from their mountain counterparts. Instead of focusing on highland raiding, the RDA military elite specialized in river warfare and amphibious operations. They trained extensively in fighting from boats along rivers and marshlands, developing specialized tactics for combat in waterlogged terrain that would have been useless in mountain warfare, but was devastatingly effective in their river delta environment. Archaeological excavations have uncovered their distinctive weapons, long spears, designed specifically for thrusting from boats and shields, with reinforced edges capable of deflecting attacks while maintaining maneuverability in the confined spaces of river channels. Every aspect of their military technology was adapted to their specific environment. Further north, the ANTES Confederation occupied what might have been the most strategically crucial territory in the entire Urian world, the transitional zone between Adriatic coastal regions and interior alpine valleys. They controlled the mountain passes that connected Italian markets with Balkan resources, making them incredibly wealthy but also constantly threatened. The ANTES faced a unique political challenge. They had to balance maintaining control over these lucrative trade routes while managing relationships with both coastal and interior neighbors who could easily become enemies. Their solution was a sophisticated system of rotating leadership, where different clans assumed primary responsibility for external relations during specific seasons corresponding to major trading periods. This arrangement was absolutely brilliant because it ensured that no single clan could monopolize the benefits of trade route control while maintaining collective security against external threats. It was like having a built-in system of checks and balances that prevented internal power struggles from destroying their confederation. In the southern coastal regions, the Polnanti Confederation controlled some of the most fertile agricultural land in the entire Urian sphere, and they developed the most stratified social structure of any confederation. Unlike other Urian groups that maintained relatively egalitarian warrior societies, the Polnanti featured distinct classes of warriors, merchants, craftsmen, and agricultural workers. What made this system work was their combination of military prowess and commercial acumen. Leading families controlled both large agricultural estates and trading enterprises that extended throughout the Mediterranean, creating wealth that supported a more complex society. The development of warrior aristocracies across all these confederations followed remarkably similar patterns despite their different environments. Young men from prominent families underwent extensive military training that began in childhood and continued through their early 20s, encompassing not just combat skills but leadership, strategic thinking, and complex honor codes. Cattle raiding served as both economic activity and rite of passage, requiring careful planning, intimate terrain knowledge, and coordination abilities that proved crucial for adult leadership roles. Meanwhile, coastal confederations developed equally complex piracy systems that operated according to intricate social and economic rules, governing everything from investment costs to profit distribution. Now we're about to witness one of the most dramatic transformations in ancient European history, or the moment when the Urians went from being scattered tribal confederations to becoming centralized kingdoms that could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest powers of the Mediterranean world. But first, let me tell you about a pivotal moment that changed everything. Picture this: around 627 BC. Greek colonists established a settlement called Epidamnis. Just wasn't just another colonial outpost. This marked a complete shift in how Mediterranean powers interacted with the Rians. Instead of the typical pattern of conquest and exploitation we see everywhere else in the ancient world, something absolutely unprecedented was happening here. For the first time, we see Greek colonists actively seeking to establish permanent commercial partnerships with Rian communities, rather than simply conducting hit-and-run trading expeditions or attempting military domination. Think about how remarkable this was minus the Greeks, who had successfully colonized much of the Mediterranean through military might, were essentially saying, we need to work with these people, not against them. Why? Because the Urians had proven themselves to be far too militarily sophisticated and politically organized to be easily conquered or manipulated. The Greeks quickly realized they were dealing with confederations that possessed serious military capabilities and political sophistication that demanded respect. These initial contacts involved incredibly careful negotiations that respected the territorial claims and political autonomy of both parties. The Greeks brought manufactured goods that appealed to Urian aristocratic tastes, mine pottery, exquisite metalwork, and luxury items that demonstrated the kind of craftsmanship that comes from centuries of urban civilization. Meanwhile, Urian communities provided exactly what Greek colonies desperately needed for survival and prosperity: raw materials including metals, livestock, and agricultural products. When Apollonia was established as another major Greek colony, it created multiple contact points between these two sophisticated cultures. But here's what makes this relationship absolutely fascinating. Unlike the purely extractive colonial relationships we see everywhere else in the Mediterranean, where powerful civilizations simply took what they wanted from less organized peoples, the Greek colonies in Urian territory operated more like trading partners than dominant powers. These commercial relationships gradually began influencing Rian political development in ways that would reshape the entire region. As confederation leaders recognized the massive advantages of maintaining stable, peaceful relations with Greek colonies, something unprecedented began to happen. Some confederations established formal diplomatic agreements that guaranteed safe passage for Greek merchants in exchange for preferential trading terms and access to Greek manufactured goods. Think about what this required. These agreements demanded sophisticated diplomatic capabilities that helped foster the development of more complex political institutions within Urian society. They weren't just making handshake deals anymore, they were creating formal treaties that required permanent diplomatic and administrative structures to maintain. The religious landscape during this period reveals something absolutely fascinating about how cultures can influence each other without one completely dominating the other. Urian religious practices began reflecting both indigenous traditions and gradually increasing Greek influence, creating what scholars call syncretic belief systems, essentially religious fusion that maintained distinctively Urian characteristics, while incorporating carefully selected foreign elements. Indigenous Rhean deities continued to receive veneration at traditional hilltop sanctuaries, where archaeological evidence reveals ongoing sacrificial activities and votive offerings that maintained perfect continuity with earlier religious practices. The cult of the great goddess, evidenced by numerous female figurines found throughout Rhean territory, remained absolutely central to religious life across all confederations. These figurines tell an incredible story. Typically carved from local stone or cast in bronze, they display consistent iconographic elements, including elaborate headdresses, prominent breasts, and ritual objects that clearly indicate their roles in fertility and agricultural ceremonies. What's remarkable is that similar figurines have been found across the entire diverse Urian territory, indicating shared religious concepts that transcended political boundaries and geographic barriers. Mountain sanctuaries like the incredible site at Chich in Bosnia reveal evidence of continuous religious use throughout this entire period of cultural change. These locations typically featured natural rock formations that served as altars, surrounded by artificial terraces where worshippers could gather for communal ceremonies. The votive offerings recovered from these sites, miniature weapons, ceramic vessels, and animal bones from sacrificial rituals, a myth that these ceremonies were designed to ensure military success and community protection. But here's where it gets really interesting. With the gradual influence of Greek religious traditions manifested primarily in urban centers, where contact with Greek colonists was most intensive. Archaeological evidence includes imported Greek pottery used in religious contexts, suggesting the adoption of certain Greek ritual practices alongside traditional Urian ceremonies. However, and this is crucial, this influence remained largely superficial. The fundamental religious concepts and practices maintained their indigenous character throughout this entire period. Now get ready for the most dramatic transformation in Urian history. The transformation from tribal confederations into centralized monarchies represents one of the most significant political developments in the Western Balkans during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The decentralized warrior societies that had dominated the region for centuries gradually gave way to powerful kingdoms capable of projecting authority across vast territories and engaging with major Mediterranean powers as equals. This wasn't a sudden revolution, Pid. It was a carefully orchestrated consolidation that occurred through military conquest, strategic marriages, economic control, and the establishment of permanent administrative centers capable of coordinating increasingly complex governmental functions. The process began among the Ardeae, where those fertile river valleys and coastal plains provided the agricultural surplus necessary to support professional armies and permanent administrative bureaucracies. Around 400 BC, a warrior named Bardilis emerged from the traditional clan structure to establish what classical sources recognize as the first true Urian kingdom. Unlike previous war leaders who held temporary authority during specific campaigns, Hyde Bardilis maintained permanent control over military forces and established a capital at Skodra, strategically positioned to control both riverine and coastal trade routes. This was revolutionary Maias. He transformed traditional Wairian military organization by creating standing units of professional soldiers who owed personal loyalty to the king rather than to clan leaders. These troops received regular pay from royal treasuries, freeing them from seasonal agricultural obligations that had previously limited campaign durations. The king's bodyguard, numbering approximately 300 elite warriors, served as the core of this new military system, with members selected based on proven combat ability rather than aristocratic birth. The architectural development of Skodra reflected these new political realities. The royal palace complex, constructed on the highest point within the city's defensive walls, included residential quarters for the royal family, audience halls for receiving foreign ambassadors, treasury buildings, and administrative offices for managing territorial governance. This was urban planning designed to project absolute royal authority while accommodating the complex needs of territorial administration. Now we're about to discover how these newly centralized Urian kingdoms became economic powerhouses that could compete with any Mediterranean civilization. What happened next will show you just how quickly these mountain and coastal peoples transformed from tribal raiders into sophisticated international players. The economic foundations of these emerging kingdoms weren't built on conquering distant lands or exploiting slave labor like many ancient powers. Instead, they did something absolutely brilliant. They leveraged their perfect geographic position to become the masters of Adriatic trade. Picture this: every single merchant caravan traveling between Italian markets and Balkan resources, every luxury goods shipment from the eastern Mediterranean had to pass through Urian territory. The RDA kingdom's strategic position was like controlling a massive ancient toll booth, except instead of collecting pocket change, royal officials were imposing transit taxes on merchant caravans that generated absolutely enormous revenues. These weren't arbitrary fees either. Ample archaeological evidence from customs posts along major trade routes reveals they had developed standardized weights and measures that actually facilitated commercial transactions while ensuring accurate tax collection. Think about the sophistication this required. They weren't just taking whatever they could grab from passing traders. They had created a systematic, professional customs service that made trade easier, while generating massive wealth for the kingdom. It was a win-win situation that kept merchants happy while filling royal treasuries. But here's where the Urian economic story gets absolutely fascinating. Deep in the mountainous interior, silver mining operations provided another crucial source of royal revenue that would literally change the course of Mediterranean history. The mines at Damastion, hidden away in the upper Drenica Valley, produced such high-quality silver ore that Urian monarchs could establish something revolutionary: their own standardized coinage systems. The earliest Urian coins, minted around 350 BC, weren't just pieces of metal for making purchases. These were sophisticated propaganda tools featuring royal portraits on one side and symbols of royal authority including crowns, scepters, and military insignia on the other. Every time someone handled these coins, they were reminded of royal power and legitimacy. What makes the development of Urian coinage systems so impressive is how it reveals their sophisticated understanding of international monetary economics. Royal mints didn't just produce random coins, they created multiple denominations corresponding to different commercial needs. Small bronze pieces for local market transactions, medium silver coins for regional trade, and large silver issues designed for major commercial dealings and diplomatic payments. Here's the genius part. The weight standards of Urian coins aligned perfectly with those used by Greek colonies and Macedonian kingdoms. This meant Urian money was accepted internationally, while maintaining distinctive iconographic elements that asserted their political independence. They were participating in the international economy while proudly maintaining their cultural identity. The military transformation under these new monarchical systems represents one of the most revolutionary changes in ancient warfare. Professional armies completely replaced seasonal warrior bands, with soldiers receiving standardized equipment, regular training, and systematic tactical instruction that turned them into some of the most feared fighters in the Mediterranean world. The famous Urian light infantry became legendary throughout the ancient world for their incredible mobility and devastating effectiveness in rough terrain. These weren't just improved versions of traditional tribal warriors. They represented a completely new approach to military organization that royal commanders developed by adapting traditional mountain warfare techniques to the needs of territorial conquest and defense. Urian light infantry units typically consisted of 500 to 1,000 men, organized into smaller tactical groups of exactly 50 warriors each. This wasn't random mind, no. This organization allowed for incredible flexibility and coordination that could adapt to any battlefield situation. These soldiers carried distinctive oval shields made from leather stretched over wooden frames and reinforced with bronze fittings, providing excellent protection while maintaining the mobility that was absolutely essential for their tactical role. Their weapons were specifically designed for their fighting style: javelins with iron points that worked for both throwing and close combat, short swords optimized for fighting in confined mountain spaces, and long daggers that served as backup weapons and utility tools. Every piece of equipment was chosen to maximize their effectiveness in the challenging terrain where they fought. The tactical employment of Irian light infantry emphasized speed, surprise, and intimate knowledge of local terrain in ways that would make modern special forces impressed. These units excelled at ambush warfare, conducting lightning-fast strikes against enemy formations before withdrawing to prepared positions where their mobility advantages could be maximized. The training regimens were absolutely brutal. Extensive marching exercises in full equipment across challenging mountain terrain developed the physical conditioning necessary for sustained operations in the rugged landscapes that characterized Irian territory. When these soldiers showed up on a battlefield, they were literally the toughest, most conditioned warriors anyone had ever seen. Cavalry units, though less numerous than infantry forces, played crucial roles that demonstrated Urian adaptability. Urian horses bred in mountain valleys and coastal plains were smaller than the massive mounts used by Macedonian cavalry, but they possessed exceptional endurance and sure-footedness in difficult terrain that made them perfect for Urian fighting conditions. As these kingdoms encountered foreign military systems through diplomatic contacts and direct combat, they showed their characteristic adaptability by learning and improving upon what they found. Greek influence appeared primarily in siege warfare capabilities, with Urian engineers learning to construct and operate massive torsion artillery engines capable of breaching the strongest fortified positions. Archaeological evidence from siege sites includes stone projectiles weighing up to 50 kilograms, indicating the deployment of substantial siege engines that required specialized technical knowledge to construct and maintain. These weren't simple catapults. These were sophisticated military machines that put Irian armies on par with any Mediterranean power. Celtic military influences manifested in the adoption of longer swords and improved metallurgical techniques that produced superior blade quality. Irian smiths learned to create pattern-welded sword blades that combined different grades of iron and steel to achieve optimal combinations of flexibility and edge retention. These weapons, typically measuring 70 to 80 centimeters in length, proved devastatingly effective in the close-quarters combat that characterized Urian warfare. But then came the ultimate test: Micius' diplomatic relations with Macedonia under Philip II. What started as territorial disputes over border regions evolved into complex negotiations involving marriage alliances, territorial exchanges, and military cooperation agreements that would determine the fate of both civilizations. Philip's expansion into Urian territories initially met fierce resistance from King Bardilus, who correctly viewed Macedonian advances as direct threats to Urian independence and territorial integrity. The resulting conflicts, fought primarily in the mountainous regions along the Macedonian-Rhian frontier, would demonstrate both the impressive military capabilities of the new Urian kingdoms and their limitations when confronting the disciplined phalanx formations that form the core of Macedonian military power. The decisive engagement between Bardilus and Philip occurred in 358 BC near Lake Ohrid, and what happened there would change the course of Balkan history forever. But the knowledge and experience these Rhian veterans brought back from Alexander's campaigns would prove absolutely crucial as their kingdoms expanded territorial control and developed governmental institutions that rivaled anything in the ancient world. However, a new player was about to enter the game, and their arrival would change everything. Roman influence in Urian affairs began creeping in gradually during the 4th century BC, and initially it seemed like just another trading relationship. As Roman commercial interests expanded across the Adriatic Sea, their first contacts occurred through Greek intermediaries, particularly those colonies of Apollonia and Epidamnus that had been successfully trading with Urian kingdoms for generations. These early interactions remained surprisingly peaceful, focusing on trade agreements and diplomatic protocols rather than the territorial disputes and military confrontations that Romans were famous for elsewhere. But here's what made this relationship different. The establishment of Roman trading posts along the Urian coast didn't just create new economic opportunities, it introduced Urian leaders to Roman political and military practices that would prove absolutely revolutionary. Roman merchants brought their usual array of manufactured goods, poles, fine pottery, exquisite metalwork, and luxury items that perfectly matched Rhean aristocratic tastes. Meanwhile, Urian territories provided exactly what Roman markets were desperately seeking: metals, livestock, and agricultural products that fed the growing Roman Empire. But what started as simple commercial exchanges gradually developed into something much more complex and significant. Roman diplomatic practices were completely different from anything the Rheans had encountered before. Unlike the more informal arrangements they'd made with Greek colonies or Macedonian kingdoms, Romans emphasized formal treaty arrangements and detailed legal frameworks that defined specific rights and obligations for all parties involved. Here's why this mattered so much. Mycenaean kingdoms found these approaches incredibly attractive because they provided far greater certainty in international relations while offering protection against more aggressive neighbors. The gradual adoption of Roman diplomatic protocols helped Rhean kingdoms develop sophisticated international relations capabilities that would serve them incredibly well in later conflicts. The period between 350 and 250 BC witnessed something absolutely remarkable: the full maturation of Urian monarchical institutions as kingdoms consolidated territorial control, developed professional military forces, and established diplomatic relationships with major Mediterranean powers. This transformation created political foundations that would enable Urian kingdoms to play significant roles in the complex international relations of the Hellenistic period, while maintaining their distinctive cultural identity and territorial independence. But then came a king who would take Urian power to heights that nobody could have imagined. The consolidation of monarchical power across Urian territories reached its absolute zenith under King Agron, who ascended to the RDA throne around 250 BC and immediately embarked on an ambitious program that would transform the entire Adriatic Sea into what people literally called an Urian lake. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused primarily on territorial consolidation and land-based military operations, Agron recognized something crucial: Maidta's true regional dominance required absolute mastery of maritime trade routes and the ability to project power across the entire Adriatic basin. What he was planning would make the Urians the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean's most important sea. Agron's naval strategy centered on the revolutionary development of the Liburnian galley, a distinctive warship design that had evolved from earlier Liburnian prototypes into an absolutely formidable instrument of naval warfare. These vessels were engineering marvels, measuring approximately 30 meters in length with incredibly shallow drafts of less than 2 meters, allowing them to navigate in waters where larger Greek and Roman ships simply couldn't go. Picture this incredible design minted the Liburnian galley. Featured a reinforced bronze ram positioned perfectly at the waterline, designed to punch through enemy hulls below the waterline, while maintaining sufficient speed and maneuverability to escape retaliation from heavier vessels. They were like ancient naval assassins, fast, deadly, and capable of striking where enemies least expected. The construction of Agron's war fleet required organizational efforts that were absolutely unprecedented in the ancient world. Royal shipyards established at Skodra, Ryazan, and other coastal centers employed hundreds of specialized craftsmen, including ship carpenters, metal workers, sail makers, and rope manufacturers. Archaeological excavations at the Ryazan shipyard complex reveal the incredible scale of these operations: massive timber storage areas, bronze working furnaces capable of producing large castings for ship fittings, and slipways designed to launch vessels directly into deep water channels. Each Liburnian galley required approximately 50 carefully selected oak trees just for hull construction, with additional timber needed for oars, masts, and internal fittings. The royal administration established systematic forestry operations deep in the mountainous interior, where teams of woodcutters worked under military protection to harvest suitable trees and transport them to coastal shipyards via complex river systems. Think about the logistical coordination this required: mountain communities, riverine transport specialists, and coastal construction crews, all working in perfect synchronization. This demonstrated administrative capabilities that would impress modern governments. The crews for these vessels came from coastal communities with generations of maritime experience. But Agron did something brilliant. He supplemented traditional sailors with trained warriors capable of both naval operations and amphibious assault tactics. Each Liburnian galley carried between 100 and 120 men, including approximately 80 rowers who could also fight as marines when required. The remaining crew consisted of specialized naval warriors armed with javelins, short swords, and grappling equipment, specifically designed for boarding enemy vessels. Training took place in protected bays along the Irian coast, where crews practiced coordinated maneuvers, ramming techniques, and boarding procedures until they achieved tactical perfection. The shallow draft of Liburnian galleys allowed them to operate in coastal waters too dangerous for larger vessels, giving Irian crews intimate knowledge of every inlet, channel, and hidden anchorage along hundreds of kilometers of coastline. Agron's establishment of naval supremacy fundamentally altered the economic and political dynamics of the entire region. Merchant vessels traveling between Italian ports and Greek colonies now required Urian permission to transit Adriatic waters, generating absolutely enormous revenues through transit fees and protective arrangements. But then, tragedy struck. The death of Agron in 231 BC brought his remarkable widow Tutor to power as regent for their young son, marking one of the most crucial transitions in ancient political history. Tutor, described by contemporary sources as possessing both extraordinary intelligence and fierce determination, inherited a naval force at the absolute peak of its capabilities, and a kingdom with unprecedented wealth and territorial control. However, she also faced mounting pressure from Roman commercial interests and Greek city-states, who viewed Rhean maritime dominance as an intolerable threat to their economic prosperity. What happened next would determine whether the Rheans could maintain their incredible rise to power or face the full wrath of Rome itself. What happened during Tutor's regency would spark one of the most dramatic naval conflicts in ancient history. But first, let me show you exactly how this incredible queen turned the Adriatic Sea into her personal empire. Tutor's regency coincided with something that would prove absolutely explosive Roman commercial activities in the Adriatic, as Roman merchants desperately sought to establish direct trading relationships with Greek colonies and exploit lucrative new markets in the Eastern Mediterranean. Here's where things get incredibly tense. These Roman commercial ventures inevitably crashed head-on with established Urian practices of controlling maritime trade through transit fees, protective arrangements, and what Romans would call selective piracy operations against vessels from hostile powers. Picture this brewing conflict. Both sides proved completely unwilling to compromise their fundamental economic interests, and tensions escalated at a pace that would make modern diplomats nervous. The expansion of Irian piracy operations under Tutor's direction wasn't random coastal raiding for quick profit. This was something far more sophisticated and terrifying. These operations followed carefully calculated strategic objectives designed to demonstrate Urian naval capabilities while generating the enormous revenues necessary for continued fleet expansion. Tutor's naval commanders received incredibly detailed instructions regarding which vessels to target, what specific cargoes to prioritize, and exactly how to treat captured crews to maximize both economic and psychological impact. Roman merchants found themselves in an absolutely nightmarish situation. Their vessels, designed for carrying maximum cargo loads rather than defensive operations, could neither outrun the lightning-fast Urian Liburnians nor effectively resist boarding attempts by expert naval warriors. It was like sending cargo trucks against Formula One race cars driven by elite special forces. The systematic nature of attacks on Roman shipping created a climate of fear that completely disrupted established trade routes and forced Roman merchants into impossible choices or alternative transportation arrangements that might not exist, or pay substantial fees for Irian protective services. Either way, Roman commercial interests were being systematically strangled. Greek city-states along the Adriatic coast faced similar pressures as Irian naval forces, expanded their operational areas to include previously secure coastal waters. The island of Issa, despite its theoretical independence, found its merchant vessels subject to Urian inspection and taxation. Meanwhile, the approaches to Apollonia and Epidamnus came under increasing Urian naval surveillance that threatened the very economic foundations of Greek colonial prosperity. But here's what makes Tutor's reign so fascinating. The political structure of the Ardii kingdom under her regency had evolved into something that would impress modern political scientists. This wasn't just a simple warrior aristocracy anymore. The royal administration had developed specialized bureaucratic institutions capable of managing incredibly complex fiscal, military, and diplomatic responsibilities that would challenge any government. The royal council that advised the monarch had transformed into something revolutionary. It included not only traditional warrior nobles, but also representatives from major merchant families, naval commanders with proven expertise in maritime operations, and administrators responsible for specific territorial regions. This wasn't tokenism. This was recognition that effective governance required expertise in commercial law, naval logistics, diplomatic protocol, and fiscal management rather than simply military prowess and aristocratic birth. What's remarkable is how they balanced centralized control with local autonomy. Tribal assemblies continued to function in outlying regions where traditional clan structures remained strong, but their role had been intelligently modified to accommodate centralized royal administration. Local assemblies retained authority over internal community affairs, including land disputes, marriage arrangements, and religious ceremonies, but questions involving taxation, military service, and external relations fell under royal jurisdiction. The integration of conquered territories presented ongoing challenges that required incredibly flexible administrative approaches. Coastal communities with established maritime traditions were typically incorporated through arrangements that preserved local leadership structures while requiring tribute payments and military service obligations. Island populations, particularly those with strategic value for naval operations, received special privileges including reduced taxation and guaranteed protection in exchange for providing naval bases and local intelligence. Inland territories faced different integration procedures that emphasized establishing royal administrative centers and appointing royal governors responsible for tax collection, military recruitment, and maintaining public order. These governors, typically drawn from proven royal administrators rather than local nobility, established permanent garrisons at strategic locations and implemented standardized legal procedures that gradually replaced traditional tribal customs with royal law. The fiscal administration demonstrated remarkable sophistication in managing diverse revenue sources, including agricultural taxation, commercial transit fees, mining operations, and proceeds from naval operations. Royal treasuries maintained detailed records with separate accounting systems for different categories of revenue, a level of financial organization that would make modern accountants impressed. Commercial law under the Ardii monarchy evolved to accommodate complex maritime trade requirements, while maintaining royal prerogatives over foreign commerce. Royal courts established standardized procedures for resolving merchant disputes, determining liability for cargo losses, and enforcing contractual obligations across diverse legal traditions. These legal innovations proved so attractive that foreign merchants actually preferred dealing with Urian ports because of the predictability and enforceability of their commercial law. Cultural developments during this period reflected the increasing wealth and international connections of the kingdom, as royal patronage supported artistic and architectural projects that demonstrated both Urian cultural sophistication and the monarchy's capacity to command substantial resources. The influence of Hellenistic artistic traditions became increasingly evident in royal projects, though these foreign influences were carefully adapted to maintain distinctively Urian characteristics. The reconstruction of Shkodra's royal quarter during Tutor's regency incorporated Hellenistic architectural principles, including carefully proportioned columns, geometric decorative elements, and planned spatial relationships between buildings. However, the overall design maintained traditional Urian emphasis on defensive capabilities and connection to natural landscape features. The new royal palace featured a great hall measuring 40 meters in length with a timber roof supported by stone columns, carved with distinctively Urian motifs, including stylized animal heads and geometric patterns derived from traditional metalwork designs. This wasn't just copying foreign styles, this was cultural fusion that created something entirely new. Urban planning in major Urian centers, demonstrated increasing sophistication in accommodating diverse functional requirements while maintaining essential defensive capabilities. Risen, serving as the kingdom's primary naval base, underwent extensive reconstruction that included new harbour facilities capable of servicing the expanded royal fleet, residential quarters for naval personnel and their families, and commercial districts designed to handle the increased trade generated by the kingdom's maritime dominance. But all of this incredible political, economic, and cultural development was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible, because Rome was growing increasingly intolerant of Arian control over their commercial interests. And what happened next would determine whether this remarkable maritime empire could survive against the rising power that would eventually dominate the entire Mediterranean world. Now, let me show you some of the most impressive engineering achievements in the ancient world, achievements that would make modern harbour engineers take notes. The harbour installations at Risen represented something absolutely extraordinary that required extensive knowledge of hydraulic principles and marine construction techniques that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. Picture this incredible feat of engineering. The main harbour featured stone-lined quays extending more than 200 meters into deep water. But here's the genius part. They incorporated carefully designed drainage systems that prevented the siltation problems that destroyed most ancient harbours, while simultaneously accommodating seasonal variations in water levels. This wasn't just building a dock, mods. This was creating a sophisticated hydraulic system that could function perfectly year-round. The shipyard facilities were equally impressive, featuring covered construction areas that protected vessels under construction from weather damage, along with specialized workshops for producing every piece of naval equipment imaginable, in bronze fittings, sailcloth, rope, and all the countless components that made their legendary Liburnian galleys so effective. This was like having an ancient naval industrial complex that could produce and maintain the most advanced warships in the Mediterranean. But the incredible engineering was just one aspect of how sophisticated Rhian society had become. Residential architecture in major urban centers revealed the increasing social stratification that accompanied the kingdom's expanding wealth and territorial control. Royal administrators, successful merchants, and naval commanders were constructing elaborate houses that would make Roman nobles envious. These weren't simple dwellings between tastes. They featured multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards with sophisticated water supply systems and decorative elements that demonstrated their owners' prosperity and cultural sophistication. These residences typically included formal reception areas for conducting business, private quarters for family use, and service areas for domestic staff. We're talking about urban planning and domestic architecture that rivaled anything in the classical world. The influence of Hellenistic artistic traditions appeared most clearly in sculptural works commissioned for royal and religious purposes. But here's what makes this so fascinating. Arian artists didn't just copy Greek styles. Stone carvers working in Arian centers learned to create realistic portrait sculptures and decorative reliefs that incorporated Greek technical methods while maintaining traditional Arian iconographic elements. Royal portrait sculptures from this period show this incredible cultural fusion plus clear Greek influence in their naturalistic treatment of human features, but retaining distinctively Arian elements including traditional royal regalia and symbolic associations with the Arian deities. This was cultural adaptation at its finest, taking the best from other civilizations while maintaining their own identity. Religious architecture during Tuta's regency demonstrated the gradual synthesis of indigenous Arian traditions with Hellenistic architectural principles and decorative conventions. New temple construction featured Greek-influenced column systems and proportional relationships, but maintained traditional Arian orientation patterns and incorporated indigenous religious symbols into their decorative programs. The temple complex at Risen included a main sanctuary building, constructed according to Greek architectural principles, surrounded by traditional Arian ritual spaces that preserve continuity with earlier religious practices. But all of this incredible cultural and architectural development was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible, because the growing tensions between Queen Tuta's kingdom and Roman commercial interests were reaching a critical juncture that would determine the fate of both civilizations. In 230 BC, a Roman embassy arrived at Scodra with demands that would change everything. The embassy, led by the brothers Gaius and Lucius Coruncanius, represented the first formal diplomatic contact between Rome and the Ardea kingdom, marking the beginning of a confrontation that would fundamentally reshape the entire political landscape of the Adriatic region. Here's what made this so explosive: misty Roman motivations for intervention extended far beyond simple protection of merchant shipping, though commercial considerations certainly played a significant role. The Roman Senate viewed Urian naval dominance in the Adriatic as a strategic threat to Roman expansion eastward, particularly given Rome's growing interest in Greek affairs and potential military operations across the Adriatic. The systematic nature of Urian piracy operations suggested a level of organization and capability that could potentially threaten Roman military transport and communication lines during future eastern campaigns. Intelligence reports reaching Rome described Urian naval capabilities in terms that genuinely alarmed senators who were accustomed to Roman military superiority in every theatre. The Urian fleet reportedly numbered over 200 Liburnians, supported by numerous smaller vessels and maintaining permanent bases at strategic locations throughout the Adriatic. These forces operated under centralized command structures that could coordinate complex operations across vast maritime territories, demonstrating organizational sophistication that rivaled established Mediterranean naval powers. This wasn't just piracy. This was a sophisticated naval empire that could challenge Rome itself. The Roman embassy's demands reflected both immediate commercial concerns and broader strategic objectives that would effectively end Rhean independence. Beyond compensation for specific attacks on Roman vessels, the Romans insisted that Tutor cease all piracy operations against Roman shipping, establish formal protocols for Roman merchant access to Rhean ports, and provide guarantees that Rhean naval forces would not interfere with Roman vessels traveling to Greek colonies. These demands effectively required Tutor to abandon the maritime policies that had generated much of her kingdom's wealth and strategic influence. It was like demanding that she voluntarily dismantle everything that made her kingdom powerful. Tutor's response demonstrated both her political acumen and her determination to maintain Rhean independence in the face of overwhelming Roman pressure. Rather than rejecting Roman demands outright, she offered limited concessions that addressed some Roman concerns while preserving essential elements of Rhean maritime policy. She agreed to investigate specific incidents involving Roman vessels and provide compensation where Rhean responsibility could be proven, but refused to accept blanket restrictions on Rhean naval operations in waters she considered part of her kingdom's territorial domain. The negotiations revealed fundamental differences in how Romans and Urians conceived of maritime sovereignty and commercial rights. Roman legal traditions emphasized the principle of freedom of navigation for all peaceful vessels, while Urian practices treated the Adriatic as territorial waters subject to royal authority and taxation. These conflicting legal frameworks made compromise extremely difficult, as concessions by either side would require abandoning fundamental principles of their respective political systems. Then disaster struck. The breakdown of diplomatic negotiations occurred when one of the Roman ambassadors, Lucius Coruncanius, was killed during a confrontation with Urian officials. Contemporary accounts provide conflicting versions of this incident. Neus Roman sources claiming that Coruncanius was murdered on Tutor's direct orders, while Urian traditions suggest that he died during a riot that erupted when local populations learned of Roman demands for unrestricted access to their territories. Regardless of the specific circumstances, Coruncanius's death provided Rome with a clear casus belli that justified military intervention. The die was cast, and the most powerful maritime empire in the Adriatic was about to face the rising military might of Rome. Roman preparations for war reflected careful strategic planning and substantial resource mobilization that demonstrated just how seriously they took the Rhean threat. The Senate authorized the construction of a fleet specifically designed for Adriatic operations, including 200 quinqueremes and numerous smaller vessels adapted for coastal warfare. These ships incorporated design modifications based on intelligence about Urian naval tactics, including reinforced hulls to resist ramming attacks and improved boarding defenses to counter Urian marine assault techniques. The Roman expeditionary force assembled for the Urian campaign numbered approximately 22,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, supported by allied contingents from Greek cities and other Mediterranean partners. Command was assigned to the consuls Gnaeus Fulvius Centimulus and Aulus Postumius Albinus, both experienced military commanders with proven capabilities in complex amphibious operations. The scale of this force demonstrated Roman determination to achieve decisive victory rather than merely punish specific Urian actions. What happened next would determine whether this remarkable maritime civilization could survive against the military machine that would eventually dominate the entire Mediterranean world. What happened next was one of the most methodical and devastating military campaigns in ancient history, and it would prove that even the most sophisticated naval empire couldn't withstand the full military might of Rome when they were truly determined to win. The campaign's secondary objectives revealed just how thoroughly the Romans planned to dismantle Rhaetorian power minor. They aimed to neutralize every single Rhaean island stronghold and establish Roman naval stations at strategic locations throughout the Adriatic. This wasn't just about winning a war, this was about permanently reshaping the entire Mediterranean power structure. The campaign opened in 229 BC with a coordinated Roman assault that would become a masterclass in combined naval and land operations. Their first target was Corcyra, where Rhaetorian forces under the brilliant commander Demetrius of Pharos had established what they thought was an impregnable garrison. But here's why this island was absolutely crucial. Its strategic importance came from controlling the Strait of Otranto, that narrow passage between the Adriatic and Ionian seas through which literally all maritime traffic between Italy and Greece had to pass. Think about what this meant. Milurian control of Corcyra effectively gave them the ability to cut off Roman communications with Greek allies and completely disrupt any potential Roman military operations in the eastern Mediterranean. It was like controlling the gateway to half the ancient world. Roman siege operations at Corcyra demonstrated the terrifying tactical advantages of their superior numbers and absolutely devastating siege engineering capabilities. The Roman fleet established a complete blockade of the island though nothing could get in or out, while land forces systematically reduced Urian defensive positions, using advanced siege techniques that would make medieval castle builders nervous. We're talking about massive battering rams, towering siege engines, and Taursian artillery that could hurl enormous stones with deadly accuracy. The Urian garrison, numbering approximately 3,000 men, fought with the characteristic determination that had made them legendary throughout the Mediterranean, but they simply lacked the resources to sustain prolonged resistance against such overwhelming Roman superiority. Demetrius of Pharos, recognizing the hopelessness of his position, made what might have been the smartest decision of his career. He negotiated a surrender agreement that preserved the lives of his entire garrison in exchange for transferring control of Corcyra to Roman forces. This wasn't cowardice, this was brilliant pragmatic thinking. He understood that continued resistance would accomplish nothing beyond unnecessary casualties, while cooperation with Rome might preserve his political position and territorial holdings. The surrender of Corcyra provided Rome with their first major strategic victory and established a crucial base for subsequent operations against remaining Urian strongholds. But what happened next showed just how methodical and unstoppable the Roman war machine had become. The Roman advance up the Adriatic coast proceeded with terrifying systematic efficiency as Roman commanders sought to eliminate every single Rhaetorian naval base, while avoiding costly siege operations that might slow down their momentum. At Apollonia, the Roman approach prompted immediate negotiations as the Greek population took one look at what had happened at Corcyra and recognized that resistance would be absolutely futile and potentially catastrophic for their commercial interests. The city's leaders made the smart choice now. They agreed to expel the Urian garrison and accept Roman protection in exchange for guarantees of continued autonomy and commercial privileges. Similar negotiations at Epidamnus resulted in another bloodless Roman victory as local authorities calculated that accommodation with Rome offered infinitely better prospects for future prosperity than continued association with what was clearly a declining Urian kingdom. The rapid collapse of Urian positions along the coast reflected both overwhelming Roman military superiority and the pragmatic recognition by Greek colonial populations that their economic future lay with the emerging Roman superpower rather than with their traditional Illyrian overlords. But Queen Tuta wasn't finished yet. Her response to these military disasters demonstrated both her strategic brilliance and her absolute determination to preserve what remained of her kingdom's independence. Rather than attempting to defend every position against impossible Roman advantages, she made the difficult but smart decision to order the evacuation of exposed coastal bases and concentrate her remaining forces at Ryazan and Skodra, where mountainous terrain and powerful fortifications offered much better prospects for sustained resistance. This strategic withdrawal preserved the core of Illyrian military capability, while forcing Romans to undertake exactly the kind of difficult siege operations in challenging terrain that they had been trying to avoid. Tuta was forcing them to fight on her terms, in the kind of mountain warfare where Illyrians had always excelled. The siege of Ryazan presented Roman commanders with their first serious tactical challenge of the entire campaign. The city's position on a narrow peninsula, surrounded by steep mountains, made conventional siege approaches extremely difficult, while Illyrian naval forces retained sufficient capability to maintain limited supply lines to the besieged garrison. Roman siege engineers were forced to construct elaborate approach works that snaked up treacherous mountainous terrain while maintaining protection against constant Illyrian attacks and deadly missile fire from elevated positions. This wasn't the easy coastal conquests they'd been enjoying. This was brutal mountain warfare against defenders who knew every rock and crevice. Roman siege operations at Ryazan required approximately 3 months of sustained grinding effort before Roman resistance finally collapsed. 3 months for Romans who had been conquering cities in days or weeks. This prolonged siege demonstrated both the incredible defensive advantages of well-chosen Rhineran positions and the absolute determination of Rhinan forces to resist Roman conquest to their last breath. Archaeological evidence from the siege tells an incredible story of desperate combat mitis Roman siege works, hold-him defensive modifications, and clear evidence of the intense fighting that characterized the final assault on the city's walls. When archaeologists excavated these sites, they found layers of destruction that speak to one of the most brutal sieges in ancient warfare. The fall of Ryazan eliminated the primary base for Illyrian naval operations and effectively ended organized resistance to Roman conquest. Even the indomitable Queen Tuta recognized that further resistance would only result in additional casualties without achieving any meaningful military objectives. She opened negotiations for a comprehensive peace settlement that would preserve her dynasty while acknowledging Roman supremacy in the Adriatic region. These negotiations reflected her understanding that political survival required accommodation with Roman power rather than futile, continued resistance that would destroy everything her people had built. The Treaty of 228 BC established a framework for Roman-Illyrian relations that would persist for the next decade, but the terms were absolutely devastating for what had once been the Mediterranean's most powerful naval empire. Under its terms, Tuta retained control over a substantially reduced territory centered on Skodra and the immediate surrounding region, while acknowledging Roman authority over all former Illyrian coastal possessions and island territories. The treaty specifically prohibited Illyrian naval operations beyond the Lissus River and required annual tribute payments to Rome as acknowledgement of Roman supremacy. The mighty Illyrian fleet that had once dominated the entire Adriatic was effectively confined to a single river system. But here's what makes the Roman approach so fascinating. Send, rather than simply annexing conquered territories directly, Rome established something innovative called protectorates over former Illyrian territories. This represented a significant innovation in imperial administration that would become a Roman trademark for centuries. Greek cities, including Apollonia and Epidamnus, became Roman allies with guaranteed autonomy in internal affairs, while maintaining obligations to provide military support for Roman operations and exclude hostile forces from their territories. The island of Corcyra received special status as a Roman naval base, with Roman forces maintaining permanent garrisons, while local populations retained control over civilian administration and commercial activities. Demetrius of Pharos emerged as the primary beneficiary of this Roman reorganization, receiving substantial territorial grants in recognition of his smart cooperation during the Roman conquest. His new domains included much of the central Dalmatian coast and numerous islands, making him one of the most powerful rulers in the post-war Adriatic region. The administrative boundaries established by this Roman reorganization created entirely new political realities that would profoundly influence not just Irian development but the entire future of southeastern Europe. The age of independent Irian maritime power was over, and the age of Roman Mediterranean dominance had officially begun. What happened after Rome's conquest would prove to be even more dramatic than the war itself, because the Romans were about to attempt something that had never been successfully done before, completely transforming an entire civilization while somehow keeping it alive. This process would become one of the most fascinating examples of cultural engineering in human history. The transformation began immediately, and it was absolutely ruthless in its efficiency. Traditional tribal territories that had existed for centuries were suddenly divided among different administrative units, completely disrupting established social and economic relationships that had defined Irian society for generations. But here's what makes this so remarkable. While destroying old systems, the Romans simultaneously created new opportunities for communities that could successfully adapt to Roman requirements. This wasn't random destruction up here. This was calculated social engineering on a massive scale. Coastal regions with strategic value received preferential treatment and enhanced autonomy, while interior territories faced much more restrictive oversight and heavier tribute obligations. The Romans had learned exactly how to use both carrots and sticks to reshape entire societies. Roman success in the First Illyrian War had demonstrated something revolutionary-minded of the devastating effectiveness of coordinated naval and land operations in achieving strategic objectives while minimizing casualties and campaign duration. Their systematic approach to reducing Irian strongholds, combined with skillful diplomacy that separated potential allies from committed enemies, provided a blueprint that Rome would use for subsequent expansion throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But the establishment of client relationships rather than direct annexation proved to be their masterstroke. This approach was incredibly successful in maintaining Roman control while dramatically reducing administrative costs and local resistance to Roman authority. They had figured out how to rule without appearing to rule. The transformation of Irian territories following the Roman conquest marked the beginning of one of the most profound cultural and administrative metamorphoses in ancient European history. When I say profound, I mean they were about to change literally everything: Mite's legal frameworks, urban planning, religious practices, and even the languages people spoke in their own homes. Roman control over the eastern Adriatic coast initiated systematic changes that would gradually reshape every single aspect of Irian society. This process, known as Romanization, didn't happen through sudden imposition like a military occupation. Instead, it occurred through the gradual, almost invisible integration of Roman administrative practices, legal systems, and cultural norms into existing Irian structures. Think of it as cultural reprogramming that happened so gradually that people barely noticed it was occurring until it was too late to reverse. The initial phase of Roman administrative organization focused on establishing effective control over strategic territories, while minimizing resistance from local populations. Roman administrators had learned something crucial. More successful governance of diverse Irian territories required incredibly flexible approaches that respected local traditions while ensuring Roman strategic objectives were met. The creation of the province of Illyricum around 168 BC represented the culmination of decades of gradual administrative development, incorporating lessons learned from earlier experiments with client kingdoms and protectorate arrangements. This wasn't just administrative reorganization, Min. This was the creation of an entirely new political entity that would reshape southeastern Europe. The boundaries of Illyricum were absolutely massive, encompassing territory stretching from the Alsia River in Istria southward to the Drin River in Albania, including most of the Adriatic islands, and extending inland to include the Dinaric mountain ranges and their associated river valleys. We're talking about an enormous province covering approximately 55,000 square kilometers that presented unprecedented administrative challenges. Managing this diverse territory with its scattered populations and complex tribal structures that had evolved over centuries of independent development required innovations in government that would influence Roman administration throughout the empire. Roman provincial administration adapted traditional Roman governmental structures to accommodate the unique requirements of governing Urian populations. The provincial governor, typically holding praetorian rank, established his headquarters at Salona, strategically positioned to control both coastal shipping routes and inland communication networks. The choice of Salona wasn't random mansit. It reflected careful consideration of geographic factors, including harbour facilities, defensive positioning, and accessibility to major population centres throughout the province. The governor's administrative staff included specialists in military affairs, fiscal management, legal administration, and engineering projects, reflecting the incredibly complex requirements of governing a territory that combined strategic military importance with substantial economic potential. Roman administrative practices emphasized systematic record-keeping, standardized procedures, and hierarchical chains of command that could coordinate activities across vast distances and diverse populations. Clay tablets and papyrus documents recovered from administrative centers provide detailed insights into the sophisticated bureaucratic systems that Roman officials developed to manage provincial affairs. Municipal organization within the province followed Roman models while accommodating existing Urian settlement patterns and social structures. Existing urban centers including Ida, Nerona, and Lissus received municipal status with standardized governmental institutions, including elected magistrates, town councils, and public works departments. These municipalities operated according to Roman legal frameworks, while maintaining sufficient autonomy to address local concerns and cultural preferences. It was a masterful balance between central control and local autonomy that kept populations satisfied while ensuring Roman dominance. The establishment of Roman colonies represented a more intensive form of administrative integration, involving the settlement of Roman citizens and veterans in strategically important locations. Colonia Julia the Fentid around 59 BC exemplified this approach with its systematic urban planning, Roman architectural standards, and population drawn primarily from Italian settlers. The colony's layout followed standard Roman planning principles with a central forum, perpendicular street grid, and designated areas for residential, commercial, and religious activities. These weren't just settlements. These were showcases of Roman civilization designed to demonstrate the advantages of Roman ways of life. The process of Romanization in rear-end territories occurred gradually through multiple interconnected mechanisms that transformed local societies without completely eliminating indigenous cultural elements. This was cultural engineering at its most sophisticated, maintaining a null local identity to prevent rebellion while gradually replacing everything that mattered. Language adoption represented one of the most visible aspects of this transformation, as Latin gradually became the primary language of administration, commerce, and education throughout the province. However, this linguistic transition occurred over several generations, with indigenous Rhian languages persisting in rural areas and domestic contexts well into the imperial period. Archaeological evidence from urban centers reveals the gradual adoption of Latin inscriptions on public buildings, tombstones, and commercial establishments. Early inscriptions often display mixed linguistic elements, combining Latin administrative terminology with Urian personal names and local place names. This transitional period, lasting approximately 150 years, demonstrates the complex negotiation between Roman administrative requirements and local cultural continuity. Educational institutions played absolutely crucial roles in facilitating language adoption and cultural transformation. Roman schools established in major urban centers provided instruction in Latin language, literature, and rhetoric for the children of local elites, creating a generation of Rhian leaders capable of functioning effectively within Roman administrative and commercial systems. These educational opportunities proved incredibly attractive to ambitious Urian families who recognized that Roman cultural competency offered pathways to political advancement and economic prosperity that had never existed before. Legal system integration proceeded through the gradual replacement of traditional Urian customary law with Roman legal frameworks and procedures. Roman courts established in provincial capitals applied Roman civil law to disputes involving Roman citizens, while initially allowing indigenous legal traditions to govern relationships between Urian community members. But here's the genius of Roman strategy now over time. The advantages of Roman legal procedures, including standardized evidence requirements, appellate processes, and enforcement mechanisms, encourage voluntary adoption of Roman law, even in cases where traditional alternatives remained available. They made people want to become Roman. The transformation of property law represented a particularly significant aspect of legal integration. Roman concepts of individual property ownership contrasted sharply with traditional Urian practices that emphasized communal land tenure and clan-based resource management. Roman administrators introduced systematic land surveys, individual title registration, and standardized property transfer procedures that gradually replaced customary arrangements. This transformation facilitated Roman-style agricultural development, while creating new opportunities for individual economic advancement that fundamentally changed how Roman society functioned at its most basic level. But here's where the Roman strategy gets absolutely brilliant. And they didn't just force people to use Roman law, they made it so attractive that people voluntarily abandoned their traditional systems. Urian merchants quickly discovered that Roman commercial law offered superior protection for their investments and far more predictable outcomes for business disputes than anything they'd experienced before. When your livelihood depends on reliable legal protection, the choice becomes obvious. Social structure transformation represented one of the most complex and fascinating aspects of Romanization that would fundamentally reshape Urian society from top to bottom. Roman administrative practices gradually modified traditional Urian clan-based hierarchies, while simultaneously creating entirely new opportunities for social mobility that had never existed in traditional Urian culture. The Roman concept of citizenship, initially limited to Italian settlers and carefully selected local elites, gradually expanded to include broader segments of the Urian population who could demonstrate loyalty to Roman authority and competency in Roman cultural practices. This wasn't just about legal status. This was about creating a pathway for ambitious Urians to literally transform their entire social position. Roman military service provided one of the most important and dramatic pathways for Urian social advancement and cultural integration. Urian recruits serving in Roman auxiliary units received intensive training in Roman military procedures, Latin language skills, and complete exposure to Roman cultural values that would transform them into essentially different people than when they enlisted. Veterans returning to their home communities after completing military service brought Roman organizational methods, technical skills, and cultural perspectives that facilitated broader social transformation throughout their communities. These weren't just former soldiers, they were cultural ambassadors who had experienced the full scope of Roman civilization and came back to share what they'd learned. The auxiliary units recruited from Urian populations became absolutely legendary throughout the Roman world for their incredible effectiveness in difficult terrain and challenging combat conditions. The coes dalmatarum and similar units served with distinction in campaigns from the foggy hills of Britain to the scorching deserts of Syria, earning recognition for their discipline, endurance, and tactical flexibility that impressed Roman commanders everywhere. These military experiences exposed Urian soldiers to the full scope of Roman civilization, while providing them with valuable skills and connections that dramatically enhanced their post-service careers. They returned home as Roman citizens with pensions, land grants, and social status that would have been impossible to achieve through traditional Urian society. Urban development throughout the province reflected the systematic application of Roman planning principles and construction techniques to create functional, defensible, and aesthetically impressive urban centers that would serve as showcases of Roman civilization. The reconstruction of Salona during the 1st century BC exemplified this approach with massive public works projects that transformed a modest Urian settlement into a major Roman administrative center, capable of supporting a population exceeding 60,000 residents. Think about that transformation, from a small tribal settlement to a major city of 60,000 people in less than a century. This represented one of the most dramatic urban development projects in ancient history. The Forum complex at Salona occupied a central position within the city's carefully planned grid layout. featuring a rectangular plaza measuring 45 by 90 meters surrounded by colonnaded porticos that provided weather protection for commercial and administrative activities. The basilica, constructed along the forum's northern edge, served multiple crucial functions including law courts, commercial exchanges, and public meetings. Its interior featured a central nave flanked by side aisles with clerestory windows, providing natural lighting for legal proceedings and business transactions. This wasn't just functional architecture. This was designed to impress visitors with the sophistication and power of Roman civilization. Infrastructure development represented a crucial component of Roman urbanization efforts, with massive investments in water supply systems, sewage networks, and transportation facilities that dramatically improved living conditions while demonstrating Roman engineering capabilities that seemed almost magical to local populations. The aqueduct system serving Salona drew water from mountain springs located more than 20 kilometers from the city, requiring incredibly sophisticated engineering to maintain proper gradients across challenging terrain while providing sufficient flow to meet the demands of a major urban center. This was engineering that wouldn't be matched again in Europe for over 1,000 years. The aqueduct's construction involved cutting through solid rock formations, building stone bridges across valleys, and creating distribution networks that supplied water to public fountains, bath complexes, and private residences throughout the city. Archaeological investigations have revealed the sophisticated valve systems, settling tanks, and maintenance tunnels that Roman engineers incorporated into the design to ensure reliable operation and facilitate repairs. Road construction throughout the province followed Roman engineering standards that prioritized durability, all-weather accessibility, and efficient movement of military forces and commercial traffic. The Via Dalmatica connecting Aquileia with Dyrrhachium represented one of the most ambitious engineering projects undertaken in the province, requiring the construction of bridges, tunnels, and mountain passes that remained in use for centuries after the fall of Roman authority. These roads could support heavy military traffic while providing reliable transportation for commercial goods and civilian travelers across terrain that had previously been nearly impassable during certain seasons. Amphitheater construction in major urban centers demonstrated both Roman commitment to providing traditional entertainment facilities and their remarkable ability to adapt standard architectural forms to local conditions and preferences. The amphitheater at Pula, constructed during the 1st century AD, featured a sophisticated design that accommodated approximately 23,000 spectators, while incorporating advanced structural engineering that allowed the building to be constructed on sloping terrain without compromising safety or visibility. The arena's underground chambers house complex mechanical systems for raising wild animals, stage props, and gladiators to arena level during performances. These facilities required sophisticated engineering knowledge and substantial financial investment, demonstrating the incredible prosperity that Roman administration had brought to Urian urban centers. Religious syncretism emerged as one of the most fascinating aspects of cultural transformation in Roman Illyria, as traditional Urian deities gradually merged with Roman religious practices, while maintaining distinctive local characteristics. This wasn't religious replacement might. This was religious fusion that created something entirely new. Archaeological evidence from religious sites reveals the gradual adoption of Roman architectural forms for temple construction, while preserving indigenous ritual practices and mythological traditions. The temple complex at Doclea exemplified this syncretic approach, featuring a main temple constructed according to Roman architectural principles, but dedicated to a deity that combined attributes of the Roman Diana with traditional Rherian goddess figures associated with hunting and mountain protection. Votive offerings recovered from the site include both Roman-style bronze figurines and traditional Urian stone carvings, indicating the coexistence of different religious traditions within the same sacred space. People were worshipping in ways that honored both their ancestral traditions and their new Roman identity. Mystery cults gained enormous popularity throughout the province during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, offering spiritual experiences that appealed to populations seeking personal religious fulfillment beyond traditional civic religious obligations. The cult of Mithras proved particularly popular among military personnel stationed in Rherian garrisons, with Mithraea discovered at military sites including Tellurium and Burnham featuring elaborate underground chambers designed for initiation ceremonies and ritual meals. Early Christianity entered Urian territories through commercial networks and military connections, initially establishing small communities in major urban centers before gradually spreading to rural areas like a slow-burning fire that would eventually transform the entire religious landscape. The martyrdom of Saint Domnius at Salona around 304 AD marked a significant moment in the province's Christian development, as his persecution under Diocletian's anti-Christian edicts demonstrated both the growing influence of Christian communities and the continuing tensions between traditional Roman religious practices and emerging Christian beliefs. Christian communities in Urian territories developed distinctive characteristics that reflected both Roman administrative influences and indigenous cultural traditions, creating forms of Christianity that were recognizably Roman yet distinctively Urian. This religious evolution represented the final stage of cultural transformation that had begun centuries earlier with the first Roman merchants arriving on Urian shores. The Urians had not simply been conquered and replaced as Barbarians, they had been transformed into something new while maintaining echoes of their ancient identity. This process of Romanization would serve as a model for cultural integration throughout the Roman Empire, demonstrating that successful imperial administration required not just military conquest, but sophisticated cultural engineering that could transform entire civilizations while keeping them recognizably alive. But the story of cultural transformation in Roman Illyria was far from over, because something absolutely revolutionary was about to emerge from this fusion of civilizations, early Christian architecture, that would create some of the most stunning religious buildings in the ancient world, while solving complex liturgical problems that had never been addressed before. Early Christian architecture in the province represented something completely unprecedented, all the incorporation of Roman construction techniques, while brilliantly adapting basilica designs to accommodate Christian liturgical requirements that were entirely different from anything Romans had built. Before the basilica complex at Salona, constructed during the 4th century AD, featured a sophisticated layout that included separate spaces for different aspects of Christian worship, while maintaining perfect architectural continuity with traditional Roman public buildings. Think about the incredible challenge this represented: 310 buildings that had to serve an entirely new religion, while looking familiar enough to Roman eyes that they wouldn't seem threatening or foreign. This was architectural diplomacy at its finest, and the results were absolutely stunning. The gradual integration of Urian populations into the Roman imperial system during the 1st through 3rd centuries AD represented one of the most successful examples of provincial assimilation in the entire history of the Roman Empire. Unlike the violent conquest and brutal subjugation that characterized earlier Roman expansion, this period witnessed something remarkable: the systematic transformation of former enemies into some of Rome's most loyal and capable subjects. This process occurred through carefully orchestrated policies that recognized Urian military potential, while providing genuine pathways for social advancement and economic prosperity within the imperial framework. The Romans had learned something crucial: you get better results by making people want to join you rather than forcing them to submit to you. Roman military recruitment in Urian territories began almost immediately after the establishment of provincial administration. And here's why this was so significant. Roman commanders had recognized the absolutely exceptional fighting qualities that Urian warriors had demonstrated during the conquest period. The mountainous terrain and harsh climate of the Dinaric Alps had produced populations with extraordinary physical endurance, intimate knowledge of difficult terrain, and cultural traditions that emphasized martial excellence like nowhere else in the ancient world. These characteristics made Urian recruits ideally suited for auxiliary service in Roman armies operating in similarly challenging environments throughout the empire. When Roman legions needed soldiers who could march 30th kilometers through mountains, carrying full equipment and still be ready to fight at the end of the day, they turned to Urians. The recruitment process operated through a combination of voluntary enlistment and selective conscription that targeted young men from communities with proven military traditions. Roman recruiting officers established permanent stations in major population centers including Salerne, Narona, and Skodra, where they maintained detailed records of eligible candidates and coordinated with local authorities to identify the most suitable recruits. The process emphasized physical fitness, basic literacy skills, and demonstrated loyalty to Roman authority, with preference given to candidates from families with existing military connections. This wasn't random conscription popes. This was systematic talent identification that would make modern military recruiters envious. Training for Rierian auxiliary units took place at specialized camps, designed to transform tribal warriors into disciplined Roman soldiers while preserving their distinctive combat capabilities that made them so valuable in the first place. The primary training facility at Tellurium, located in the Cetina River Valley, could accommodate approximately 5,000 recruits simultaneously in barracks complexes that provided both military instruction and cultural orientation. The curriculum included intensive Latin language instruction, Roman military drill procedures, weapons training with standardized Roman equipment, and comprehensive instruction in Roman military law and customs. This was like attending a military university that could transform mountain tribesmen into professional soldiers capable of serving anywhere in the known world. The transformation of traditional Ierian fighting methods into Roman auxiliary tactics required incredibly careful adaptation that preserved indigenous strengths while incorporating Roman organizational principles. Ierian light infantry techniques, particularly their unmatched expertise in mountain warfare and rapid movement across difficult terrain, proved absolutely invaluable for Roman armies operating in frontier regions, where traditional heavy infantry formations proved less effective. Roman military instructors developed specialized training programs that enhanced these natural abilities, while teaching Roman tactical coordination and command structures. They weren't trying to turn Urians into Roman legionaries. They were creating something entirely new that combined the best of both military traditions. Auxiliary units recruited from Urian populations typically served 25-year enlistments that took them far from their homeland territories to garrison duties throughout the Roman Empire, and their service records read like a catalogue of the empire's most challenging campaigns. The Coesires Prima Delmatarum served with distinction in Britain, where their mountain warfare skills proved crucial during the brutal campaigns in Wales and Scotland. Archaeological evidence from Hadrian's Wall includes inscriptions recording the service of Arian auxiliary units, along with distinctive equipment and personal items that demonstrate the cultural connections these soldiers maintained with their homeland, despite decades of foreign service, thousands of kilometers away. The reputation of Arian auxiliary forces spread throughout the Roman military establishment like wildfire, leading to preferential recruitment policies that actively sought Arian soldiers for the empire's most challenging assignments. The Coes Brucorum gained legendary status for their service along the Rhine frontier, where their expertise in river-crossing operations and forest warfare proved invaluable during Germanic campaigns that tested even the most experienced Roman forces. Similar units served in Dacia, Pannonia, and other frontier provinces, where their specialized skills and proven reliability made them absolutely indispensable components of Roman military strategy. When Roman commanders needed soldiers who could succeed where others failed, they called for Rierians. Military service provided Urian soldiers with unprecedented opportunities for social advancement and cultural integration within the broader Roman world that would have been impossible through any other pathway. Veterans returning to their home communities after completing their service brought substantial savings accumulated during their military careers, along with Roman citizenship rights that extended to their families and fundamentally changed their social status. These veterans often became local leaders and successful merchants, using their military connections and Roman legal status to establish prosperous businesses and dramatically advance their social positions. They were living proof that cooperation with Rome could lead to prosperity that previous generations could never have imagined. The economic prosperity that characterized Urian territories during the Pax Romana period reflected both the abundant natural resources of the region and the systematic development policies implemented by Roman administrators who understood how to maximize the economic potential. The province's strategic location along major trade routes connecting Italy with the Balkans and Eastern Mediterranean provided substantial opportunities for commercial development, while Roman investment in infrastructure and urban development created conditions conducive to sustained economic growth. Agricultural development throughout the province benefited enormously from Roman engineering expertise and systematic land management practices that dramatically increased productivity while ensuring sustainable resource utilization. The fertile river valleys of the Neredeva, Cetina, and Kearkea rivers underwent extensive development during this period, with Roman engineers constructing sophisticated irrigation systems, drainage networks, and flood control measures that transformed previously marginal lands into highly productive agricultural areas. The introduction of Roman agricultural techniques and crop varieties revolutionized farming practices throughout Urian territories in ways that increased both productivity and profitability. Roman agricultural specialists introduced improved plowing methods, scientific crop rotation systems, and selective breeding programs that increased yields while reducing labor requirements. This wasn't just farming masses, this was agricultural engineering that maximized every hectare of available land. Olive cultivation, previously limited to narrow coastal areas, expanded into interior valleys, where Roman engineers created terraced growing areas protected from harsh mountain winds. Similarly, viticulture spread throughout regions with suitable soil and climate conditions, establishing wine production as a major economic activity that would continue for centuries. Mining operations represented another crucial component of the province's economic development, as Roman engineers applied advanced extraction techniques to exploit the region's substantial mineral resources with unprecedented efficiency. The silver mines at Domavia produced high-quality ore that supplied Roman mints throughout the empire, while iron mining operations in Bosnia and Montenegro provided raw materials for weapons production and massive construction projects. Lead mining in the Drina River Valley supplied material for water pipes, construction applications, and other industrial uses throughout the Roman world. Roman mining techniques employed in Rhaean territories demonstrated remarkable engineering sophistication, with extensive underground tunnel systems, sophisticated drainage networks, and mechanical lifting devices that allowed extraction from previously inaccessible deposits. The mining complex at Domavia featured underground workings, extending more than 300 meters below surface level, supported by timber frameworks and connected by carefully engineered ventilation shafts that provided fresh air for workers operating in incredibly dangerous conditions. This was industrial engineering that wouldn't be matched again for over a millennium. The growth of trading cities throughout the province reflected both increased commercial activity and systematic urban development policies that created attractive conditions for merchants and craftsmen from across the Mediterranean world. Salona emerged as the province's primary commercial center, with harbor facilities capable of accommodating the largest merchant vessels operating in the Adriatic, transforming it into one of the most prosperous cities in the entire Roman Empire. What had begun as a Roman conquest had evolved into something far more remarkable, played a complete economic and social transformation that created prosperity beyond anything the ancient Urians could have imagined, while preserving enough of their cultural identity to maintain the warrior spirit that made them so valuable to Rome. But what happened next in these thriving Roman Rhaean cities would create some of the most prosperous commercial centers in the entire ancient world, and the scale of their success will absolutely blow your mind. The city's commercial district represented something unprecedented in the ancient Balkans' pervert markets, massive warehouse complexes, and specialized facilities for different types of merchandise that created a shopping and trading experience that wouldn't look out of place in a modern commercial center. We're talking about grain storage facilities that could feed entire armies, wine cellars that supplied the finest vintages throughout the Mediterranean, and metalworking shops that produced everything from household items to military equipment, with precision that impressed even Roman engineers. Salona's population during the 2nd century AD exceeded 60,000 residents, making it one of the largest cities in the entire Roman Balkans. To put that in perspective, this was a population larger than most modern cities in the same region today, and all of this incredible growth happened over just a few generations of Roman development. The city's prosperity attracted merchants from throughout the Mediterranean world, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that facilitated cultural exchange and technological innovation on a scale that transformed the entire region. Archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of specialized craft production that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about ancient manufacturing capabilities. We're talking about sophisticated glass-making operations, ceramic production facilities that created pottery exported throughout the Roman world, metalworking shops that produced both utilitarian and luxury items, and textile manufacturing operations that supplied both local markets and international export trade. This wasn't just a city minder. This was an ancient industrial complex that could compete with anything in the Roman Empire. But Salona wasn't the only success story. Siccia, strategically positioned at the confluence of the Sava and Kupa rivers, developed into a major inland commercial center that controlled crucial trade routes connecting the Adriatic coast with Pannonia and the dangerous Danube frontier. Think about the strategic importance of this location. Every single trade good moving between the Mediterranean world and the northern frontiers had to pass through Urian-controlled territory. The city's location provided perfect access to river transportation networks that allowed incredibly efficient movement of bulk commodities, including grain that fed the legions, timber that built the empire's infrastructure, and metal products that armed Rome's armies. Roman engineers constructed extensive port facilities along both rivers with stone-lined quays, massive warehouse complexes, and specialized loading equipment that facilitated rapid cargo transfer between different transportation modes. Here's what will really amaze you. This development of Siccia as a major mint facility demonstrated not just the city's economic importance, but the Roman government's complete confidence in the region's stability and prosperity. This mint produced coins for circulation throughout the Rherian provinces and neighboring regions, with production levels that required substantial supplies of precious metals and incredibly skilled craftsmen. Archaeological evidence from the mint complex includes sophisticated furnaces that could achieve temperatures necessary for precise metalworking, precision weighing equipment that ensured coin accuracy, and die-cutting tools that demonstrate the advanced metallurgical techniques employed in Roman coin production. This was ancient high-tech manufacturing that produced currency used across half the known world. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire transformation was the rise of Urian elites within Roman society itself. Unlike many other provincial populations who remained largely excluded from positions of real authority within the Roman hierarchy, Urians achieved absolutely unprecedented success in military, political, and administrative careers that took them to the highest levels of Roman society. The military careers of Urian officers reflected both their exceptional capabilities and Roman recognition of their incredible potential for leadership positions that could determine the fate of the empire itself. Marcus Valerius Maximianus, born in Sirmium to an Urian family, rose through the ranks to command entire legions in multiple provinces before achieving senatorial rank and serving as provincial governor in Africa. His career demonstrated the incredible possibilities available to talented individuals from Urian backgrounds who successfully navigated the complex world of Roman military and political institutions. This wasn't tokenism, Morton, this was genuine recognition of superior ability and leadership potential. Urian senators became increasingly prominent in Roman political life during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, with several achieving consulships and other high magistracies that put them among the most powerful people in the ancient world. Their success reflected both individual merit and the growing recognition of Urian territories as absolutely integral components of the Roman Empire, rather than merely conquered provinces that were administered from a distance. These senators typically maintained strong connections to their homeland regions, using their political influence to secure beneficial policies and development projects for Urian communities. They were representing their people at the highest levels of imperial government and actually making a difference. The administrative careers of Urian officials demonstrated their remarkable capacity for effective governance and their sophisticated understanding of Roman institutional practices. Gaius Julius Proculus, from a prominent Salona family, served as procurator in multiple provinces, before achieving equestrian rank and appointment to high-level financial positions within the imperial administration. His career illustrated the pathways available for ambitious Urians who combined local connections with Roman administrative expertise, a combination that proved incredibly valuable for managing the complex challenges of governing a vast empire. Military commanders of Rhenian origin achieved particular distinction during the crisis of the 3rd century, when their leadership capabilities and deep understanding of frontier warfare proved absolutely crucial for imperial survival during Rome's darkest hours. The Emperor Claudius Gothicus, born in Dardania, demonstrated the military excellence that characterized Rhenian leadership during this incredibly challenging period. His victories against Gothic invasions and his administrative reforms helped stabilize the entire empire during one of its most difficult periods. When Rome needed leaders who could save civilization itself, they turned to men of Rhenian origin, who had the skills and determination to succeed where others failed. Cultural achievements during this period reflected the remarkable synthesis of Roman and indigenous Rhenian traditions that created distinctive artistic and intellectual expressions, unlike anything else in the ancient world. Architectural monuments throughout the province demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Roman construction techniques, while incorporating decorative elements and spatial arrangements that reflected local preferences and cultural values. The palace complex constructed at Split by Emperor Diocletian represented the absolute culmination of Romano-Rhenian architectural development, combining imperial Roman grandeur with practical adaptations to local climate and defensive requirements that created something entirely unprecedented. This complex measured approximately 215 by 180 meters, enclosed by walls reaching heights of 20 meters in some sections, basically a fortified city within a city. The internal layout featured a sophisticated combination of residential quarters, administrative offices, religious spaces, and defensive installations that reflected both imperial requirements and regional architectural traditions. Diocletian's palace incorporated advanced engineering techniques including sophisticated heating systems, water supply networks, and sewage disposal arrangements that demonstrated Roman technological capabilities while perfectly adapting to local conditions. The peristyle courtyard, measuring 35 by 13 meters, featured elaborate columns and decorative elements that combined classical Roman proportions with distinctive regional stonework techniques that created visual effects never seen before in Roman architecture. Literary production in Roman Illyria reflected the incredible educational achievements of local populations and their sophisticated engagement with broader Roman intellectual traditions. Writers from Rhenian backgrounds contributed to various genres including historical works, poetry, and technical treatises that demonstrated both classical learning and distinctive regional perspectives that enriched Roman literature. Artistic production throughout the province demonstrated remarkable creativity in combining Roman techniques with indigenous decorative traditions and symbolic systems that preserved ancient Rhenian identity while embracing Roman sophistication. Sculptural works from this period show clear Roman influence in their realistic portrayal of human figures and attention to anatomical detail, while incorporating traditional Rhenian motifs and symbolic elements that maintained connections to local cultural traditions. Mosaic art achieved particular distinction in Roman Illyria, with workshops in Salona and other major centers producing sophisticated works that decorated public buildings, private residences, and religious installations throughout the province. These weren't just decorative elements. These were artistic masterpieces that combined the best of two great civilizations into something entirely new and beautiful. What had begun as a Roman conquest had evolved into something far more remarkable, a complete cultural renaissance that preserved the best of ancient Rhenian civilization while embracing the opportunities offered by Roman imperial membership, creating a hybrid culture that would influence European development for centuries to come. Intricate floor decorations that told stories without words, masterpieces that have survived for nearly 2,000 years to amaze us today. These stunning artworks showcased complex geometric designs that would make modern mathematicians jealous, legendary tales from ancient mythology that brought gods and heroes to life beneath people's feet, and lifelike depictions that revealed something truly remarkable: the incredible skill of local craftsmen who had mastered the art of blending Roman techniques with their own cultural touches and whatever materials they could find locally. But here's what makes these mosaics even more extraordinary. They weren't just pretty decorations. Every single piece told us something profound about the people who created them. These artists had taken the sophisticated Roman artistic playbook and completely transformed it, adapting classical themes to reflect local tastes, regional stories, and the unique materials available in their specific corners of the empire. Imagine Greek mythological scenes reimagined through provincial eyes, or geometric patterns that incorporated local artistic traditions passed down through generations before Rome ever arrived. The technical mastery required for these works was absolutely staggering. We're talking about craftsmen who could calculate precise angles, match colors across thousands of tiny stone pieces, and create images so realistic they seemed to breathe. But they weren't just copying Roman templates, they were innovating, experimenting, and pushing the boundaries of what mosaic art could achieve. This creative adaptation would prove to be a perfect metaphor for what was about to happen in the political realm. But here's where things get absolutely fascinating, and this is where our story takes a dramatic turn. When Rome's central government started crumbling during the notorious 3rd century crisis, something completely unexpected happened. Military leaders from distant provinces suddenly saw their chance to grab the ultimate prize, imperial power itself. And there was one region that produced more of these ambitious commanders than anywhere else: the rugged territories of Illyria. Think about it. For centuries, these provinces had been considered the frontier, the edge of civilization, places where tough men learned to fight against impossible odds. But that perceived disadvantage was about to become their greatest strength. While senators in Rome debated and politicians schemed in marble halls, these provincial officers were out there getting their hands dirty, learning real leadership, and understanding what it actually took to hold an empire together. Between 235 and 284 AD, the entire Roman political system essentially fell apart like a house of cards in a hurricane. Traditional institutions that had held the empire together for centuries simply stopped working. The old rules no longer applied. The carefully constructed balance of power that Augustus had established was completely shattered. Into this chaos stepped a parade of soldier emperors, and here's the kicker: most of them came from those same mountainous regions and coastal areas that had been churning out Rome's finest military minds for over 200 years. This wasn't coincidence. It was the inevitable result of centuries of Roman military recruitment patterns. The empire had systematically drawn its best soldiers from these tough frontier regions, because that's where you found men who knew how to fight, how to lead, and how to survive when everything went wrong. Now, when the empire itself was fighting for survival, these same regions would provide not just soldiers, but emperors. Now let me introduce you to someone who perfectly represents this new breed of imperial hopeful, a man whose story encapsulates everything we're talking about: Gaius Messius Quintus Decius, born sometime around 201 AD in a small village called Budalia, located near the strategically important city of Sirmium. This guy wasn't your typical Roman aristocrat born into privilege in some palatial villa overlooking the Seven Hills. Instead, he embodied something completely different and infinitely more dangerous. But don't mistake provincial for unsophisticated. Decius represented a new kind of Roman elite, one forged in the crucible of frontier warfare, but educated in the finest traditions of Roman law and administration. He was the perfect fusion of practical military experience and classical Roman education, a combination that would prove devastatingly effective in the chaos of the 3rd century. His family story is pretty remarkable too, and it tells us everything we need to know about how the empire was changing. The Decius clan had become part of the rising Illyrian nobility, people who had actually thrived under Roman rule rather than simply enduring it. They weren't conquered subjects nursing ancient grievances. They were success stories, families who had embraced Roman opportunities and turned them into generational wealth and influence. They owned vast stretches of fertile land along the Sava River Valley, some of the most productive agricultural territory in the entire empire. But their wealth wasn't just about farming. They had built strong connections with the military establishment through generations of family members, serving in auxiliary units and working their way up through provincial government positions. This wasn't just about one ambitious individual. This was about an entire family network that had been preparing for this moment for decades. What made families like the Decius clan so dangerous to the traditional Roman establishment was that they combined provincial toughness with Roman sophistication. They understood both worlds perfectly. They could speak the language of Roman law and administration just as fluently as they could read battlefield tactics and tribal politics. They had the loyalty of the legions because they'd served alongside common soldiers, but they also had the education and connections to navigate the complex world of imperial politics. This combination would prove to be exactly what the empire needed during its darkest hour. Traditional Roman aristocrats, for all their refinement and education, had become too removed from the harsh realities of frontier warfare. They could debate philosophy and recite poetry, but when Gothic warriors came pouring across the Danube, they needed leaders who knew how to fight back. But here's where things get really interesting, and this is going to blow your mind. The reforms that Claudius implemented weren't just random policy changes, they were surgical strikes at the heart of what was destroying the Roman military. Think about it. When you're fighting brutal campaigns that stretch for months against barbarian forces who know the terrain better than you do, unit cohesion becomes literally a matter of life and death. One moment of hesitation, one breakdown in communication, and entire legions could be massacred. Claudius understood this at a gut level that desk-bound administrators in Rome never could. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention, but was absolutely crucial minor. The monetary policies that Claudius implemented tackled one of the empire's most devastating problems, runaway inflation and currency debasement that had essentially destroyed economic activity throughout the known world. Picture trying to run an empire when your money is worthless. Soldiers refuse to fight for coins that can't buy bread. Merchants stop trading because they can't trust the currency. The entire economic foundation of civilization starts crumbling. Claudius did something brilliant. He established brand new minting facilities right there in Illyrian territories, particularly at Sicya, which became a powerhouse of reliable standardized coinage production. This wasn't just about making money, Mick, it was about restoring trust. When frontier armies could hold coins that actually contained real silver, when merchants knew they weren't being paid with worthless metal, the entire economic system started functioning again. The transportation costs dropped dramatically because you didn't have to ship currency across half the empire, and monetary distribution in frontier regions improved overnight. Here's what's absolutely fascinating about the coins produced during his reign. The silver content showed marked improvement over previous issues. This wasn't accidental. It reflected both access to rich Illyrian mining resources and systematic efforts to restore confidence in imperial currency. Every coin became a promise that Rome was back in business. Enter Lucius Domitius Aurelianus. Born around 214 AD in Dacia Repensis, to a family with strong Illyrian connections. This guy continued the pattern of military excellence that was becoming the trademark of 3rd century emperors from the Danubian provinces. But Aurelian wasn't just another tough frontier commander. He was a strategic genius who understood something that previous emperors had missed. His early career in frontier military units provided him with extensive experience dealing with the tactical nightmares of defending massive border regions against multiple barbarian groups, while simultaneously maintaining internal security in provinces filled with diverse populations and competing local interests. Imagine trying to keep the peace among Greeks, Celts, Germans, and Romans while also watching for Gothic raiders on the horizon. The promotion opportunities available to capable officers from provincial backgrounds allowed him to advance rapidly through military ranks despite his relatively humble origins. But here's the key: Mightis, every step up that ladder taught him something new about the empire's real problems. Aurelian's military innovations represented the culmination of tactical developments that had evolved throughout the entire crisis period, combining traditional Roman organizational strengths with adaptive techniques developed through constant warfare against barbarian opponents. His creation of specialized cavalry units equipped with improved armor and weapons reflected systematic analysis of combat requirements in the mobile warfare that characterized 3rd century conflicts. Archaeological finds from military sites associated with his campaigns reveal something absolutely remarkable: standardized equipment modifications designed to improve cavalry effectiveness while maintaining compatibility with existing logistical systems. This wasn't random experimentation. This was scientific military development turning the Roman war machine into something more flexible and deadly than it had ever been before. The reunification campaigns that restored imperial control over breakaway territories demonstrated Aurelian's understanding of both military strategy and political psychology. His systematic approach to reducing the Gallic Empire emphasized isolating different regional power centers while offering reasonable terms to communities willing to return to imperial allegiance. He wasn't just conquering Minai, he was healing the empire's wounds. The siege techniques employed against fortified positions showed clear evolution from traditional Roman methods, incorporating lessons learned from decades of siege warfare against both barbarian strongholds and rebel Roman fortifications. When Aurelian's forces surrounded a city, they weren't just building bigger catapults, Mino, they were implementing cutting-edge military science. But here's what really shows Aurelian's genius: his construction of new defensive walls around Rome itself. This represented both a practical response to barbarian invasion threats and a symbolic assertion of imperial determination to defend the empire's heartland. The wall system, extending approximately 19 kilometers around the city's expanded perimeter, incorporated advanced engineering techniques, including multiple defensive lines, sophisticated gate systems, and provisions for coordinated artillery deployment. The project's completion within just 5 years demonstrated the organizational capabilities that Illyrian administrators had developed through their provincial experiences. We're talking about moving millions of tons of stone, coordinating thousands of workers, and creating a defensive system that would protect Rome for centuries to come. The economic reforms implemented during Aurelian's reign addressed fundamental structural problems that had undermined imperial stability throughout the crisis period. His establishment of standardized taxation procedures, improved collection mechanisms, and systematic auditing requirements provided more reliable revenue sources while reducing opportunities for corruption and fraud. The monetary reforms that restored silver content to imperial coinage helped stabilize prices and restore confidence in commercial transactions throughout the empire. Marcus Aurelius Probus, born around 232 AD in Sirmium to a family with extensive military connections, represented the final phase of Illyrian military leadership during the 3rd century crisis. His upbringing in one of the most militarized regions of the empire provided early exposure to professional military culture and the strategic challenges facing frontier commanders. The educational opportunities available in Sirmium, which had developed into a major administrative center, combined practical military training with the legal and administrative knowledge necessary for high-level governmental positions. Probus's military career began during the Gothic campaigns under Claudius Gothicus, where he gained valuable experience in the innovative tactical methods that Illyrian commanders had developed for barbarian warfare. His rapid promotion through military ranks reflected both personal capabilities and the systematic advancement opportunities that the crisis period provided for talented officers willing to accept dangerous frontier assignments. By 270 AD, he commanded substantial military forces and possessed the experience necessary for independent campaign leadership. The defensive strategies developed under Probus emphasized systematic fortification of frontier regions combined with mobile reserve forces capable of rapid response to invasion threats. But here's where Diocletian completely revolutionized everything, and this decision would echo through history for centuries. The selection of co-rulers wasn't based on who had the fanciest bloodline or the biggest palace. It was based on proven administrative and military capabilities. This was management by merit, not inheritance, and it reflected Diocletian's deep understanding of what effective governance actually required in the real world. The administrative revolution that Diocletian's tetrarchy initiated fundamentally transformed how Illyrian territories were governed. For the first time in generations, these crucial frontier regions had leaders who understood both their strategic importance and their unique challenges. The system worked brilliantly until it didn't. Here's where everything started going catastrophically wrong, and you need to understand this because it explains how one of Rome's strongest regions became the empire's greatest vulnerability. The system's collapse in the early 4th century created unprecedented weaknesses that would expose these regions to devastating barbarian invasions unlike anything they'd ever faced before. When Diocletian died in 316 AD, the carefully constructed tetrarchy died with him. The subsequent civil wars between his successors didn't just create political chaos, they shattered the coordinated defensive strategies that had protected the Danubian frontier for decades. Imagine a perfectly orchestrated military machine suddenly losing its conductor. Every part starts operating independently, communication breaks down, and coordination becomes impossible. Constantine's victory at the Battle of Chrysopolis in 324 AD restored imperial unity under a single ruler. But here's the tragic irony. By the time he won, the damage to frontier defenses and military organization had already created opportunities that barbarian confederations were desperately waiting to exploit. The empire was unified again, but its most critical defenses were in ruins. The Gothic invasions that began in earnest around 376 AD represented something completely different from anything Rome had faced before. This wasn't just another barbarian raid that previous generations of Illyrian commanders had successfully contained during the 3rd century crisis. This was something far more dangerous and infinitely more complex. Unlike previous barbarian incursions that consisted primarily of seasonal raiding expeditions, seeking portable wealth and glory, these movements involved entire populations seeking permanent settlement within Roman territories. We're not talking about warriors looking for a quick fight and some loot. We're talking about entire civilizations on the move, complete families seeking new homes, and they weren't planning to leave. The Visigoths, driven westward by Hunnic pressure from the steppes, arrived at the Danube frontier with approximately 200,000 people. Think about that number for a moment. 200,000 people, including warriors, families, livestock, and portable possessions that clearly indicated their intention to establish permanent communities rather than simply conduct traditional raids. This was migration on a scale that Roman administrative systems had never been designed to handle. Roman authorities initially tried to manage this massive migration through traditional diplomatic arrangements. The plan seemed reasonable on paper, might settle Gothic populations in designated areas under Roman supervision, while utilizing their military capabilities for frontier defense. It was classic Roman thinking. Turn a potential problem into an asset. Emperor Valens authorized Gothic settlement south of the Danube in 376 AD, expecting that controlled immigration would provide agricultural workers and military recruits while reducing pressure on overextended Roman military resources. But here's where Roman bureaucratic arrogance met reality, and lost spectacularly. The scale of Gothic migration completely overwhelmed Roman administrative capabilities. Worse, corruption among Roman officials responsible for managing the settlement process created conditions that rapidly deteriorated into open warfare. When you're dealing with desperate people who have nowhere else to go, and then you cheat them or abuse them, you're not creating grateful subjects, you're creating furious enemies. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD marked the catastrophic failure of Roman attempts to control Gothic settlement through military force. This wasn't just another battlefield defeat. To me, this was a complete strategic disaster that changed the course of European history. Emperor Valens personally led an army, estimated at 40,000 men, against Gothic forces that had been reinforced by other barbarian groups and Roman military deserters. The engagement demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred in barbarian warfare as Gothic cavalry units coordinated with infantry formations to achieve tactical superiority over traditional Roman military arrangements. Valens died in the fighting, along with approximately 2/3 of his army, eliminating the primary Roman military force responsible for Danubian frontier defense. When an emperor dies alongside most of his army, you don't just lose a battle mauls, you lose the entire strategic initiative in a region. The immediate aftermath of Adrianople created a power vacuum in the Central Balkans that Gothic forces quickly exploited through systematic occupation of major urban centers and transportation networks. This wasn't random destruction neither, this was strategic conquest by people who understood how Roman systems worked. Philippopolis fell to Gothic assault in 379 AD, after a brief siege that demonstrated barbarian adaptation of Roman siege techniques. The city's capture provided Gothic forces with substantial supplies of weapons agricultural products, and manufactured goods while establishing a secure base for further operations. Archaeological evidence from the siege tells an absolutely fascinating story. Gothic manufactured arrowheads and spear points show clear Roman influence in their design and metallurgy, indicating rapid technological transfer between barbarian and Roman military systems. These weren't primitive raiders made the same. These were sophisticated warriors who learned quickly and adapted Roman technology to their own purposes. Sirmium, the former imperial capital and crucial administrative center for the Illyrian provinces, endured repeated Gothic attacks throughout the 380 CE that gradually weakened its defensive capabilities and economic foundations. The city's strategic position at the confluence of major river systems made it an attractive target for Gothic forces seeking to control transportation networks, connecting the Danube frontier with interior Balkan regions. Roman garrison forces, reduced by casualties from earlier engagements and lacking reliable reinforcement from imperial authorities, will prove increasingly unable to maintain effective resistance against coordinated Gothic siege operations. When you can't replace your losses and your enemies keep getting stronger, military mathematics becomes brutally simple. The Gothic occupation of Sirmium in 441 AD marks the effective end of Roman administrative control over the central Illyrian territories. Unlike earlier barbarian raids that focused on portable wealth, Gothic forces systematically dismantled Roman governmental institutions while establishing their own administrative systems based on tribal leadership structures. Roman legal codes were replaced by Germanic customary law. Latin administrative language gave way to Gothic vernacular in official proceedings. Traditional Roman taxation systems were abandoned in favor of tribute arrangements that reflected barbarian political traditions. This wasn't just conquest and mest, this was civilizational replacement. But just when you thought the situation couldn't get any more complex, enter the Avars Manes, Wolsto, and these guys were about to change everything once again. The Avars were a nomadic confederation from the Central Asian steppes who brought military technologies and organizational methods that proved superior to both surviving Roman forces and all the earlier barbarian settlers. This wasn't just another group of raiders or migrants, see. These were professional warriors who had perfected the art of conquest on the vast steppes of Asia. Their rapid conquest of Pannonia and expansion into Dalmatia eliminated the last vestiges of Roman administrative control, while establishing a powerful nomadic empire that dominated the central Balkans for over 2 centuries. Think about that, minus over 200 years of Avar dominance in what had once been Rome's most militarized frontier region. This was complete strategic reversal on a scale that ancient historians could barely comprehend. What made the Avars so devastatingly effective? Their military organization relied on heavy cavalry units, equipped with advanced metallurgical products including laminated armor systems and composite bows that provided significant tactical advantages over both Roman and Germanic opponents. These weren't the crude weapons of primitive raiders, we're talking about sophisticated military technology that had been refined through centuries of steppe warfare. Archaeological excavations at Avar burial sites reveal something absolutely remarkable: sophisticated metalwork techniques that combined steppe traditions with technologies acquired through contact with Byzantine and Persian civilizations. These people were technological innovators, constantly adapting and improving their equipment by learning from every civilization they encountered. The standardization of weapons and equipment across Avar territories indicates centralized production systems and systematic military organization that enabled coordinated operations across vast geographic areas. The establishment of Avar administrative centers at strategic locations throughout former Illyrian territories created entirely new political structures that replaced both Roman governmental institutions and earlier barbarian arrangements. These centers were typically located at elevated positions with excellent defensive characteristics and access to transportation networks, serving as bases for Avar military operations while providing administrative coordination for tribute collection and population management. The Avar stronghold at Kestili controlled access to major alpine passes, while maintaining surveillance over surviving Roman populations in coastal regions. This wasn't random placement minus. This was strategic genius, positioning their power centers to control both trade routes and potential escape paths for subject populations. But here comes the final major demographic transformation, and this one was completely different from everything that had come before. Slavic migrations during the 6th and 7th centuries AD represented something unique in the history of the region. Unlike earlier barbarian movements that involved organized military forces seeking conquest or settlement, Slavic expansion occurred through gradual infiltration of agricultural populations seeking available farmland in regions disrupted by previous conflicts. Archaeological evidence suggests that Slavic communities initially established small settlements in marginal areas avoided by earlier inhabitants, gradually expanding into more desirable territories as their populations grew and earlier inhabitants relocated or were absorbed. This was demographic replacement through peaceful settlement rather than military conquest, and it proved incredibly effective precisely because it was so gradual and non-threatening. The agricultural technologies employed by Slavic settlers proved particularly well adapted to the environmental conditions of former Illyrian territories. Their emphasis on grain cultivation, livestock management, and forest exploitation provided sustainable economic foundations that enabled permanent settlement in regions where earlier populations had relied heavily on trade and urban-based economic activities. Archaeological evidence from early Slavic settlements reveals sophisticated agricultural tools, storage systems, and livestock management facilities that indicate systematic adaptation to local environmental conditions. These people weren't just farmers, they were agricultural engineers who understood how to make the land produce sustainably over generations. Slavic settlement patterns typically emphasize small, dispersed communities located near reliable water sources and fertile agricultural land. Unlike Roman urban centers or barbarian strongholds that concentrated populations for defensive purposes, Slavic villages spread across the landscape in patterns that maximized agricultural productivity while minimizing vulnerability to military attack. This settlement strategy proved highly effective in regions where centralized political control had collapsed and traditional defensive arrangements no longer functioned reliably. Meanwhile, the survival of Romanized populations during this period of demographic upheaval occurred primarily in coastal cities and mountainous refuges, where geographic conditions provided natural defensive advantages. Salona maintained its Roman character throughout the 5th and 6th centuries, despite repeated barbarian attacks, serving as a crucial link between surviving Roman territories and the broader Mediterranean world. The city's population during this period included substantial numbers of refugees from interior regions, creating a concentrated Roman community that preserved classical cultural traditions while adapting to increasingly difficult political circumstances. These weren't just survivors Mayan, they were the keepers of Roman civilization in a world that was rapidly forgetting what Rome had been. Epidaurus, protected by its position on a narrow peninsula and continued access to maritime trade networks, developed into another major center of Roman cultural continuity. The city's bishops maintained contact with religious authorities in Constantinople and Rome, preserving Christian institutional structures while adapting liturgical practices to accommodate the changing demographic composition of their congregations. Archaeological evidence from religious sites reveals continued use of Latin in religious contexts, while vernacular languages increasingly dominated secular activities. This linguistic division tells us everything about how Roman identity was transforming, mind becoming something associated with religion and formal education rather than daily life. Mountain communities in the Dinaric Alps developed distinctive survival strategies that combined traditional Illyrian pastoral practices with Roman administrative techniques and Christian religious frameworks. These communities typically occupied elevated positions that provided both defensive advantages and access to seasonal grazing areas essential for livestock management. Their political organization evolved from Roman municipal structures toward clan-based arrangements that could function effectively without external governmental support, while maintaining sufficient military capability to resist barbarian raids. This was political evolution in action, taking what worked from the old system and adapting it to new realities. The transformation of religious practices during this period reflected both the Christianization of barbarian populations and the adaptation of Christian institutions to changing political circumstances. Arian Christianity, favored by many Germanic tribes, competed with Orthodox Christianity for influence among barbarian populations, while creating theological divisions that complicated political relationships between different barbarian groups. Archaeological evidence from religious sites reveals the construction of new churches built according to barbarian architectural preferences, while maintaining traditional Christian liturgical arrangements. Monasticism emerged as a crucial institution for preserving classical learning and Christian traditions during the political chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries. Monastic communities established in remote locations throughout former Illyrian territories maintained libraries, scriptoriums, and schools that preserved Latin literary traditions while adapting classical educational methods to contemporary needs. The monastery at Salona maintained one of the largest libraries in the Western Balkans, with manuscripts that included classical literary works, Christian theological treatises, and practical manuals covering agriculture, medicine, and engineering. The gradual emergence of successor kingdoms during the 6th and 7th centuries created new political frameworks that combined barbarian military organization with adapted Roman administrative practices. These kingdoms typically controlled limited territories centered on major urban centers or strategic geographic positions, lacking the resources and organizational capabilities necessary for governing the vast territories that had characterized earlier Roman provincial administration. Here's where the story gets absolutely fascinating, and this transformation will completely change how you think about the collapse of civilizations. Roman legal concepts of citizenship, those carefully constructed definitions that had held the empire together for centuries, suddenly gave way to something completely different: ethnic identity markers that emphasized cultural practices, religious affiliations, and political loyalties rather than formal legal status. Think about what this means. For hundreds of years, being Roman was a legal concept. You had papers, you had rights, you belonged to a system that stretched from Britain to the Middle East. But now being Roman was becoming something you practiced, something you believed, something you lived, not something bureaucrats in a distant capital decided you were. Archaeological evidence reveals the gradual disappearance of distinctively Roman material culture as local populations adopted hybrid practices that combined Roman, barbarian, and indigenous elements. This wasn't sudden replacement minus, this was cultural evolution in real time, communities taking what worked from different traditions and creating something entirely new. Urban centers that survived the barbarian invasions underwent fundamental transformations that reflected changing economic conditions and political requirements. The bustling commercial hubs that had connected vast trade networks across Europe suddenly contracted to serve primarily local needs. It's like watching global cities transform into small towns, but the reasons were brutally practical. Monumental architecture fell into disrepair as resources were redirected toward defensive installations and basic infrastructure maintenance. When you're worried about survival, you don't spend money on fancy buildings, you spend it on walls that can keep your family alive. The Forum at Salona provides a perfect example of this transformation. This grand public space was gradually converted into a fortified compound that served defensive rather than commercial functions. Residential areas were modified to accommodate extended families and clan-based social organizations that differed substantially from earlier Roman household arrangements. The nuclear family was giving way to larger kinship groups, because survival required cooperation on a scale that individual families couldn't manage. But here's what's truly remarkable about this transformation. It created the foundation for understanding how Illyrian cultural elements persisted into the medieval period and beyond. As traditional Roman administrative structures collapsed and new political entities emerged from the demographic chaos of the 5th through 7th centuries, the question of cultural continuity became increasingly complex and absolutely crucial for understanding modern Europe. The survival of certain linguistic patterns, archaeological evidence, and institutional practices provides crucial insights into how ancient Illyrian civilization influenced subsequent historical developments in the Balkans. This isn't just academic curiosity, This is about understanding how cultures survive catastrophic political collapse. The linguistic legacy of the Illyrians represents one of the most contentious areas of modern scholarship, and the debates get incredibly heated. Competing theories about the survival of Illyrian language elements in contemporary Albanian and other Balkan languages generate intense academic debate that sometimes resembles ancient territorial wars fought with footnotes and phonetic charts. Proponents of Albanian-Illyrian continuity point to specific phonetic patterns, grammatical structures, and vocabulary items that appear to show direct descent from ancient Illyrian linguistic traditions. The Albanian language contains numerous words for geographical features, agricultural practices, and pastoral activities that lack clear Indo-European etymologies, suggesting possible preservation of pre-Roman linguistic substrates in mountainous regions where administrative control remained limited throughout the imperial period. Here's what makes this absolutely fascinating. The phonetic system of modern Albanian displays several characteristics that distinguish it from other Indo-European languages in the region, including specific sound changes and consonant clusters that some linguists interpret as evidence of Illyrian substrate influence. It's like finding ancient DNA in a modern language. The treatment of certain Latin loanwords in Albanian shows patterns that differ from those found in other Romance languages, potentially indicating that these borrowings occurred through Illyrian intermediaries rather than direct contact with Latin speakers. This suggests that Illyrian communities served as cultural bridges, preserving and transmitting linguistic elements even as political systems collapsed around them. Archaeological evidence from late Roman and early medieval sites in Albania reveals inscriptions that combine Latin administrative terminology with personal names and place names that appear to preserve pre-Roman linguistic elements. However, here's the challenge that drives scholars crazy. The limited corpus of definitively Illyrian linguistic material makes definitive conclusions extremely difficult to establish. The ancient sources that preserve Illyrian words and names provide insufficient data for reconstructing the phonetic system, grammatical structures, or vocabulary of ancient Illyrian languages with the precision necessary for detailed comparative analysis. Modern Albanian shows clear influences from Latin, Slavic, Turkish, and Greek languages that accumulated over centuries of cultural contact, making it challenging to isolate specifically Illyrian elements from later linguistic developments. But recent archaeological discoveries have provided new insights that are absolutely revolutionary. Excavations in remote mountain communities, where Roman administrative influence remained limited, reveal the survival of Illyrian cultural practices in ways that will surprise you. Excavations at sites in the Dinaric Alps reveal settlement patterns, architectural techniques, and material culture that show remarkable continuity from the pre-Roman period through the early medieval era. Stone construction methods, defensive arrangements, and domestic architectural features found at these sites display characteristics that appear to preserve indigenous traditions while incorporating selected Roman technological innovations. The hilltop settlement at Komen in northern Albania exemplifies this cultural continuity, with archaeological layers revealing continuous occupation from the late Roman period through the early medieval era. The site's defensive walls incorporate construction techniques that combine Roman masonry methods with traditional dry stone building practices, characteristic of pre-Roman Illyrian settlements. Pottery assemblages from different chronological levels show gradual stylistic evolution rather than abrupt replacement, suggesting cultural continuity despite changing political circumstances. This is cultural resilience in action, minus communities adapting and evolving while maintaining core elements of their identity. Cemetery excavations throughout the former Illyrian territories reveal burial practices that preserved indigenous traditions while adapting to Christian religious requirements. The necropolis at Kruja shows burial orientations, grave goods, and monument types that maintain continuity with pre-Roman practices, while incorporating Christian symbols and Latin inscriptions. Personal ornaments, weapons, and domestic items found in these burials display decorative motifs and manufacturing techniques that appear to preserve traditional Illyrian artistic traditions despite centuries of Roman cultural influence. These artifacts tell stories of cultural persistence that written sources never recorded, Archaeological contributions to understanding ancient Balkan civilization have expanded dramatically through systematic excavations conducted since the mid-20th century. The excavation of Doasun revealed sophisticated urban planning and defensive architecture that demonstrated the complexity of pre-Roman Illyrian political organization. The site's massive stone walls, carefully planned gate systems, and internal organization provided concrete evidence for the advanced engineering capabilities and social organization that characterized major Illyrian settlements. These weren't primitive tribal communities. These were sophisticated urban civilizations with their own architectural traditions and engineering expertise. Major excavations at Sirmium have revealed the evolution of urban planning and architectural development from the late Republican period through the collapse of Roman authority, providing detailed evidence for the economic activities, social organization, and cultural practices of one of the most important administrative centers in the Roman Balkans. Now here's where this ancient story collides with modern politics in absolutely explosive ways. And you need to understand this because it explains so much about European conflicts that are still happening today. Albanian nationalist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries didn't just casually mention their ancient heritage, they promoted theories of direct descent from ancient Illyrians as part of a deliberate, calculated effort to establish historical legitimacy for territorial claims and cultural distinctiveness from neighboring Slavic populations. Think about what's happening here. When you're trying to build a nation, when you're fighting for independence or territorial rights, you need more than just contemporary political arguments. You need a story that goes back centuries, something that proves you belong to the land you're claiming. The Illyrians provided that story, and Albanian intellectuals seized on it with both hands. But here's where it gets really interesting and competitive. Croatian historical traditions have similarly emphasized connections to ancient Illyrian populations, particularly in coastal regions where Roman sources documented extensive Illyrian settlement. So now you have two different modern peoples, both claiming the same ancient heritage, both using it to support their own territorial and cultural claims. Medieval Croatian chronicles incorporated references to Illyrian predecessors, while adapting these traditions to support contemporary political arrangements and territorial claims. This wasn't accidental, Michiels. This was strategic historical narrative building, taking ancient sources and reshaping them to serve modern political needs. Archaeological evidence from Croatian coastal sites reveals cultural continuities that span the transition from Roman to medieval periods. Though here's the crucial point, the interpretation of this evidence remains heavily contested among scholars with different theoretical perspectives. The same pottery sherd, the same burial practice, the same architectural technique can be interpreted completely differently, depending on which modern national narrative you're trying to support. The complexity of ethnic continuity in the Balkans reflects a reality that makes nationalist historians incredibly uncomfortable. Modern national identities emerged through historical processes that involved multiple population groups, cultural influences, and political developments over many centuries. There's no pure descent, no unbroken line from ancient Illyrians to any single modern people. The demographic disruptions of the 5th through 7th centuries created conditions where traditional ethnic boundaries became completely blurred through intermarriage, cultural exchange, and political realignments that produced entirely new social formations. When entire populations are on the move, when political systems are collapsing, when survival depends on cooperation across traditional ethnic lines, the neat categories that modern nationalists love simply don't exist. Archaeological evidence suggests that survival and adaptation occurred through complex processes rather than simple linear descent from ancient populations. This is cultural evolution in action, not biological inheritance, and understanding this distinction is crucial for making sense of Balkan history. The historiographical evolution in Illyrian studies reflects changing scholarly methodologies and theoretical approaches that have developed dramatically since ancient times. Classical sources, including Appian's Illyrian Wars and Caesar's commentaries on Roman history, provided the foundation for understanding Illyrian political development and military organization, though these accounts reflect Roman perspectives and political objectives rather than neutral historical analysis. medieval chroniclers incorporated classical references to Illyrian peoples, while adapting these traditions to contemporary political and religious frameworks that emphasized Christian identity and medieval political arrangements. Each generation of historians has essentially rewritten Illyrian history to serve their own contemporary needs and theoretical frameworks. Modern archaeological and linguistic research has substantially expanded our understanding of Illyrian civilization, while simultaneously raising entirely new questions about cultural continuity and ethnic identity. The development of systematic excavation techniques, scientific dating methods, and comparative linguistic analysis has provided evidence for the complexity and sophistication of ancient Illyrian societies that earlier scholars could never have accessed. However, and this is absolutely crucial, these methodological advances have also revealed the severe limitations of available evidence and the extreme difficulty of establishing definitive conclusions about many aspects of Illyrian history and culture. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know, and how much of what we thought we knew was actually speculation or wishful thinking. Ongoing debates about Illyrian ethnogenesis reflect fundamental disagreements about the nature of ancient ethnic identity and the processes through which cultural groups formed and evolved. Some scholars emphasize the role of migration and population replacement in shaping ancient Balkan demographics, while others focus on cultural transformation and adaptation processes that occurred within relatively stable population groups. Here's what makes this so frustrating for scholars and so useful for politicians. Archaeological evidence can support multiple interpretative frameworks, making scholarly consensus nearly impossible to achieve on many fundamental questions. The same evidence can be used to support completely contradictory theories about ethnic continuity, cultural development, and political succession. But here's what we can say with confidence, and this is where the story becomes truly remarkable. The legacy of the Illyrians ultimately transcends simple questions of direct ethnic descent or cultural survival. The historical significance lies in their role as intermediaries between the classical Mediterranean world and the indigenous populations of southeastern Europe, facilitating cultural exchanges that enriched both traditions while creating entirely new synthetic forms. The political institutions, military techniques, and cultural practices that emerge from this interaction influenced subsequent historical developments throughout the Balkans and contributed to the complex ethnic and cultural landscape that characterizes the region today. This isn't about bloodlines myths. This is about cultural DNA, the ways that ideas and practices get passed down and transformed across generations and political systems. The archaeological record demonstrates that Illyrian communities achieved remarkable success in adapting to changing political circumstances while maintaining essential elements of their cultural identity. Their integration into the Roman imperial system provided opportunities for social advancement and cultural development, while preserving distinctive regional characteristics that influenced imperial policies and administrative practices. The military leadership that emerged from Romanized Illyrian communities played absolutely crucial roles in imperial defense and political development during some of the most challenging periods in Roman history. These weren't just provincial soldiers, Mattis. These were the men who literally saved the empire during its darkest hours. The collapse of Roman authority and subsequent barbarian invasions created conditions that tested the resilience of cultural traditions established during centuries of Roman rule. The survival of certain linguistic elements, archaeological continuities, and institutional practices suggests that Illyrian cultural influences persisted through these traumatic periods, though in modified forms that reflected adaptation to new political and demographic realities. The emergence of medieval political entities in former Illyrian territories incorporated elements of Roman administrative practice, Christian religious traditions, and indigenous cultural patterns that created distinctive regional identities. This synthesis became the foundation for much of medieval Balkan civilization. Modern scholarly understanding of Illyrian civilization continues to evolve as new archaeological discoveries, linguistic analyses, and historical interpretations provide fresh perspectives on ancient developments. The application of scientific techniques including DNA analysis, isotope studies, and advanced dating methods offers potential for resolving some long-standing debates about population movements, cultural relationships, and chronological sequences. However, the complexity of ancient ethnic and cultural processes ensures that many fundamental questions about Illyrian history will remain subjects of scholarly debate and investigation for generations to come. Some mysteries may never be solved, and that's probably for the best mindset that keeps the field exciting and prevents any single political narrative from claiming definitive historical support. The enduring fascination with Illyrian history reflects both the intrinsic interest of their remarkable achievements and their relevance to contemporary questions about cultural identity, political development, and historical continuity. Their success in creating sophisticated political institutions, military organizations, and cultural traditions, while maintaining regional distinctiveness, provides valuable insights into the processes through which ancient societies adapted to changing circumstances while preserving essential elements of their heritage. The Illyrian experience demonstrates the dynamic nature of cultural development and the complex relationships between political power, cultural identity, and historical memory that continue to shape human societies today. Their story isn't just about the ancient pars natir, it's about how cultures survive, adapt, and influence the future in ways that their creators could never have imagined.